Welcome to the fantasy audiobook. Harry Potter. I, Uchiha Itachi, become a wizard in the Harry Potter world. Chapter 21. During the class, Professor McGonagall gave them a match and asked them to turn the match into a needle before the get out of class ended. Julian succeeded immediately, because he changed countless times during the summer vacation. Looking at the already successful Julian, Professor McGonagall happily added 5 points to Julian. However, Professor McGonagall was obviously overjoyed. Not everyone was as good as Julian, and only Hermione was able to change the match until the end of get out of class. This made Professor McGonagall's icy face melt a little bit. In order to let the young wizards master this basic transformation magic, Professor McGonagall assigned a super long paper and practice homework. Of course, Julian's homework was exempted. After class, Julian followed Professor McGonagall to the professor's office. Professor McGonagall came to the desk and took out a tome and a notebook that looked a little yellow from the drawer. Professor McGonagall handed these two things to Julian, and said to him, "Julian, this is the detailed explanation of Animagus. These are the notes I took when I was studying Animagus. I know that even if I stop you, you will not give up learning this magic, but I have to remind you, Julian, Animagus is a very dangerous magic. You can learn these theoretical knowledge, but promise me, never try it alone. You must practice it with my company, and you must not reveal these things to other students to see. Can you promise me, Mr. Willis?" Professor McGonagall said very seriously, and from the way she called Julian, it can be seen how much she takes this matter seriously. After making a solemn promise, Julian left the professor's office with two things. Instead of going back to the lounge, Julian went directly to the library, found a quiet place, and started to read books and notes. Because of the blood eye, Julian quickly wrote down the contents of the book. Then start to understand the content of the book bit by bit in front of the notebook. Among the books Julian bought in Diagon Alley was the book on Transfiguration, which gave him a solid theoretical foundation. Julian, who had been studying all the time, even missed his lunch. By the time he realized it, the afternoon charm class had already started. Julian flew all the way to the charms classroom, apologized to Professor Flitwick, and walked over to the empty seat Harry and Ronald gave him. In this class, Professor Flitwick did not teach any advanced magic, but taught young wizards how to use wands correctly. After all, there are too many young Muggle-born wizards this year. After class, Harry and Ronald asked Julian what he was doing and even missed lunch. Julian didn't go into details, just said that he went to the library to read a book. In this way, Julian began to move around the dormitory, library, and classroom every day, living a full and regular life. The frequency of that dream is also getting higher and higher. Julian plans to learn the Animagus before Christmas, and then go to the Forbidden Forest to explore and see what is in the Forbidden Forest. It was Friday soon, and today was the day of potions class. Unlike most Gryffindors, Julian didn't show a sad expression. Professor Snape's dislike of Gryffindors has long been rumored among young wizards. On the contrary, he was very excited. Because of the bottle of enchantment potion, Julian was quite interested in potions. In the Leaky Cauldron, besides Transfiguration, Julian studied potions the most. He himself also often tried to practice refining potions, which were all very simple potions, so he succeeded. And he has been learning the pharmacology of various medicinal materials, and tried to prepare potions by himself, which really allowed him to concoct something, but unfortunately the potions were not stable and could easily explode. Julian tried many stabilizers and neutralizers, but nothing solved the problem. So when Julian planned to go to Hogwarts, he asked the teachers of the school to see if the teachers of the school had a solution. The reality gave him a slap in the face. He'd slapped the potions professor in the face on the first day of school, the hard-hitting kind. This put a temporary hold on the desire to visit the potions professor. And today is finally the potions class, maybe it's a chance. After breakfast, a group of young wizards quickly packed up their things and went to the potions classroom. The potion classroom is underground. In a dark classroom, the classroom is full of bottles and jars. Under the candlelight, it looks even more terrifying and weird. After the little wizards were seated, after a while, Professor Snape opened the door and came in, then walked to the podium with strides, and began the routine dismounting. Apparently Professor Snape was successful, as you can tell by the frightened pale faces of the little wizards. Then Professor Snape took out the roster and began to roll the roll. When Harry was called, Professor Snape paused, and then began to mock Harry. Julian was a little surprised when he saw Snape's attitude towards Harry. He knew that Snape hated Harry, but what he didn't know was that Snape's hatred for Harry had reached this level. Julian shivered and thought to himself, Professor Snape will treat me as he treated Harry soon. Seeing Harry, who was being questioned by Snape, look at him for help, Julian was stunned. Harry, don't look at me, you and Professor Snape fell in love and killed each other, just don't draw the flames on me. As if cooperating with Harry, Snape ignored Hermione, who had been raising her hand high, and turned his gaze to Julian, and said in a tone as if he had discovered a new world, "Ah, Julian Willis, the genius of Gryffindor." Snape put Gryffindor was a strong word. "Warless, answer the question I just asked," Snape ordered. Julian smiled wryly, but still didn't hide. "Okay, Professor." Then he perfectly answered the question that was used to torture Harry just now. Very perfect, so perfect that it was exactly the same as the content in the book. After Julian finished answering, Snape said with a look of disgust, "You idiot who only copied textbooks, Gryffindor deducted 1 point, because Potter didn't answer my question." Willis sat down. "Don't you know how to sit down after answering the question?" Gryffindor another 15 minutes. Julian had a wry smile on his face. Although he knew that Snape would target him, he didn't expect to target him so badly. Potions class continued, but Harry and Julian's situation remained unchanged. Even if Julian finished the potion ahead of time, it didn't change his situation. Until the end of Get Out of Class, Gryffindor deducted a total of 8 points, Julian and Harry contributed 6 points, and the remaining 2 points were contributed by Neville, because he failed to refine the potion according to the standard and caused a teaching accident. After the school bell, the little wizards rushed out, especially the little wizards of Gryffindor, who ran very fast. After a while, the classroom was emptied. Julian hadn't left yet. What he was waiting for was now. He walked towards Snape, who had just emptied the lab table and was about to leave. Julian said, "Sorry, Professor, can I take a moment of your time? I want to ask you a question." Snape looked at the little wizard in front of him in surprise. He didn't expect that the little wizard would have the guts to ask him a question after he was stunned. "I don't know what to ask with your head, but my time is limited," Snape said grimly. Julian, who understood what Snape meant, quickly handed over the prepared notebook and said, "Professor Snape, this is a formula I discovered by accident when I was experimenting with potions before school started. Its function is to increase the magic power of wizards in a short period of time, but the results of the experiment show that the medicinal properties of Chimajasma japonica and snow weed, making the structure of the potion less stable and prone to explosion. I tried to use Daniel stabilizer and Gabriel neutralizer. Although the 2 drugs are effective, the effect of the drug is greatly reduced, so that it cannot be used at all. I want to ask if you have any good ways to solve this problem." Looking at the eloquent little wizard in front of him, and then at the formula and medicinal formula he handed to him, Snape was stunned for a while, and then asked, "Did you think of this yourself? I heard Dumbledore say that you once have you ever drank a bottle of enchantment potion?" "Yes, Professor, I didn't drink all of that bottle of potion, there were still 2 drops at the bottom of the bottle, and I got inspiration from these 2 drops," Julian replied. Snape was silent for a while, then said, "Find me in the second basement classroom at 8 o'clock tonight, I'll take your notebook first." After finishing speaking, Snape walked towards the door without looking back. When he reached the door, Snape paused and said, 20 points for Gryffindor." After speaking, he left. Julian stared blankly at Snape's back, and smiled with a corner of his mouth. "It's not as unkind as I imagined." In fact, what Julian didn't expect was that the reason why Snape gave him extra points was not because he came up with a novel potion formula, but because his formula inspired Snape a lot. With Snape's character, he would not admit that Julian's such a big favor. "That's why I gave Julian 20 points for the first time." Then Julian packed his things and left the potions classroom. Returning to the common room from the potions classroom, Ronald and Harry rushed out of the men's bedroom when Julian packed up his things and was about to eat. "What did you do, Harry, and I couldn't find you?" Ronald asked quickly. "Oh, I have some questions to ask Professor Snape, so I stayed in the potions classroom for a while. What's the matter? Is there anything urgent for you?" Julian looked at the rushing Ronald and Harry and asked strangely. You asked Snape that old bat question. My God, what's wrong with you, Julian? Ronald asked, looking at Julian in surprise. It's Professor Snape, Ronald. And although Professor Snape's character is indeed a bit unacceptable, Professor Snape's nature is not bad. Actually, I was very interested in potions and transfiguration before I came to Hogwarts, so I read a lot of books about them and encountered a lot of questions about them. The transfiguration problem has been solved for me by Professor McGonagall, and the potions problem, of course, by Professor Snape. Julian replied as a matter of course. You really love to study, Ronald said with a twitch of his mouth. Forget it, now is not the time to talk about this. Harry received an invitation from Hagrid to go to his cabin. Are you going? Now. Yes, it's now, Harry confirmed. Okay, wait for me, I'll put the textbooks down. Julian went to the boys' dormitory. By the time the three of them came out of the castle, it was already past noon. So, are you sure you don't want to eat some? Julian asked with a sandwich in his hand, looking at Harry and Ronald. No, I think there must be plenty of food in Hagrid's hut. Harry declined. Well, I think you'll regret it, Julian muttered after eating the sandwich in one bite. The three came to Hagrid's hut, and Harry knocked on the door. After a while, Hagrid's voice came from the door. Wait a minute, open the door right away. Fang Fang retreats, the sound of Fang Fang retreating. The door was quickly opened, and Hagrid's huge body appeared in the doorway. Good afternoon, Harry, Hagrid said in a very cheerful tone. Good afternoon, Hagrid, the three responded in unison. Hagrid, this is Ronald, Ronald Weasley, this is Julian, you should remember. Harry pulled Ronald closer to him and introduced him. Oh, of course, who else has red hair like that but the Weasleys? Please come in. Hagrid seemed sensitive to the Weasley name. Once the three were seated, Hagrid poured them each a cup of tea and prepared some rock muffins. Bill, Charlie, Percy, Fred, George Weasley is your brother, right? Although it was a question, Hagrid spoke in an affirmative tone. Ah, yes, Ronald replied with some embarrassment. Wow, Ronald, you never told me you have so many brothers. Harry said in surprise. Harry, you left out Ginny, Julian reminded. Bill works at Gringotts in Egypt, right? Hagrid asked. Yes, Ronald replied. And Charlie, he's a good boy. I remember Charlie loved Quidditch very much. Has he joined the Quidditch club? Hagrid asked again. No, Charlie is now raising dragons in Romania, Ronald said in an envious tone. Raising dragons. Apparently Hagrid had a different feeling for dragons. Julian had no doubts that if Hagrid had a dragon egg of his own, he would raise the dragon himself. Percy Weasley is a good student, but a bit rigid, said Hagrid, not caring that Ronald was still here. Apparently Ronald didn't take it seriously, but nodded frantically to express his agreement with Hagrid's words. In fact, these children of the Weasley family, except Bill and Charlie, Harry and Julian have seen each other, and even have some understanding of their characters. The relationship between the children of this family was not as good as expected. Apart from the age gap, the psychological gap was even more obvious, which made the brothers divided into several small groups. Not good with each other. This is easy to see. The twin brothers have had the Marauders map for a long time, but they haven't even used it to look at their brother. If they did, they would find that Percy or Ronald had a man called Peter Pettigrew's mouse, and the twins have also said that if Percy can climb to the top, he can even send his family to Azkaban. It's all evidence of the bond between the Weasley family's young brothers. How inconsistent. Of course, they are still brothers in the face of right and wrong. Brothers Fred and George Weasley, I spent most of my life trying to drive them out of the Forbidden Forest, Hagrid continued. What else could Ronald say? He could only continue to smile awkwardly. After chatting with the Weasleys, Hagrid turned his guns on Julian. As for you, Julian Willis, I didn't know what you did in Diagon Alley until I got back to Hogwarts that day. You bad boy, you shouldn't have done that, Hagrid said. Hagrid, Malfoy insulted Julian the other day, with harsh words, Harry explained. I know, I just wanted to say that it's too dangerous for Julian to do this. That family is terrible. The Malfoys were even supporters of you-know-who before. They're all dangerous, Hagrid continued. What, then why weren't they arrested by the Ministry? Harry was clearly surprised by this. Don't you understand, Harry, they are nobles. They can be easily forgiven if they make up something that Voldemort has confused. This is the reality of the wizarding world. Harry, this is the reality. Julian answered for Harry. The Malfoy family has existed for nearly 10 centuries from ancient times to the present. Their network of relationships is so huge. In fact, there are quite a lot of connections among the nobles in the wizarding world. One hair can affect the whole body. Look at I slapped the Malfoys in the face so badly that day, and it didn't do them any harm at all. Julian continued to Harry. Seeing the topic getting heavier, just when Harry was about to be doubted by Julian, Julian said, "Actually, Harry, the Potter family and the Weasley family are all nobles, so you don't have to be disappointed in the wizarding world." Well, there are many families like the Weasleys in the wizarding world. They are all kind and friendly to muggles. The Potter family. Harry lowered his head, as if thinking about something. Harry, who lowered his head, was attracted by the newspaper on the wooden box next to the chair. He hastily pulled Julian and said, "Julian, look at this, isn't July 31st the day you took me shopping? Maybe we'll be there that day." The goblin at Gringotts says the contents of the broken-in vault were taken a month ago, Harry continued. "A month ago," Julian repeated. "A month ago was the day when Professor Dumbledore took me to Gringotts, and I do remember what Professor Dumbledore went to fetch. Coincidentally, the vault that was broken into wouldn't be this." "It's very possible." "No, the possibility is very high," Harry said excitedly. "Julian, do you know what Professor Dumbledore got?" "Well, not very sure, because I didn't go to get that thing with Professor Dumbledore," Julian replied regretfully. "Really, that's such a pity." Harry and Ronald also said very pity. "By the way, speaking of Hagrid, do you know what Professor Dumbledore took?" Julian looked at Hagrid and asked. Seeing Hagrid's tense expression, it was obvious that he knew something. Harry and Ronald looked at Hagrid expectantly, hoping to get something from Hagrid's mouth. But Hagrid obviously didn't want to say anything, and the three disappointed in the end didn't ask anything from Hagrid's mouth. It wasn't until close to dinner that the three of them headed back to the castle with rock muffins from Hagrid in their pockets. None of the three ate the rock muffin, because the rock muffin was as hard as a brick. It was nearly 8 o'clock in the evening, and Julian left the Gryffindor common room with his experiment notes. When I came to the second basement classroom, it was exactly 8 o'clock. Julian knocked on the door, and it opened a moment later. Professor Snape looked at him sullenly, and said, "Come in." Then Julian followed Snape into the second classroom. The two stopped in the middle of the room. Snape turned around sharply, looked at Julian and said, "Tell me about your design ideas." "No problem, Professor. My original intention is to increase the magical endurance of wizards. Because of the scarcity of magic enhancement potions, the magic power of most wizards in the wizarding world is extremely low. Everyone let their magic power grow naturally with age. This result has led to even adult wizards, and few people have reached a considerable level of magic power. So this potion that can temporarily increase the magic power of wizards was born in my mind. As we all know, there are some parts of the body of many magical creatures in the world that can increase the magic power of wizards. But because their magic power or poison is too strong, the fragile bodies of wizards cannot withstand their medicinal power, so I selected several mild medicinal herbs and materials that can provide wizards with considerable magic power, and then adjusted them according to their medicinal properties and pharmacology so that they reached a ratio that could achieve the desired effect. I figured out the formula, and I also controlled the amount of chimajasma flower and snowy winter grass as the core materials within a very small range. Unfortunately, the medicinal properties of the two medicinal materials conflicted, so I had to use a stabilizer and neutralizing agent to stabilize and neutralize, but although the stabilizer and neutralizing agent have worked, these two agents also greatly reduce the effect of the agent, which has not reached the one I expected. My experiment encountered a bottleneck, so I came to ask you for help, Professor Snape. I hope that with your help, I can perfect this potion, and of course I will pay you," said Julian. "Payment? HMPH, you can't afford my salary," Snape said contemptuously. Then Snape turned and pointed to a lab table and continued. "That table is yours now. If you need any medicinal materials, go to the shelf to get them. If you don't have any on the shelf, tell me and I'll deal with them. But if you waste medicinal materials, just give me all the garbage you refine. Drink it." "Okay, Professor," Julian agreed. Knowing that Snape agreed to help him, so Julian put down the lab notebook and went to the shelf to find the materials he needed. After Julian collected all the materials, he returned to the experiment table that Snape had assigned to him. The materials Julian needs are very common, because Julian intends to use this potion to the entire wizarding world, so the cost must not be too high. Remove the neutralizing potion, replace the root of the draw grass with the leaves of the magic tree of Robbie, and refine the potion again. I'll have a look, Snape ordered. Of course Julian readily agreed, and for the next 2 hours, Julian did it. Snape watched, and 2 hours later Julian poured his results into a test tube, and the whole potion took on a beautiful silver color. Up to this moment, Snape still didn't speak, but called a house elf and ordered it to drink the potion. Julian didn't stop it, because he knew that Snape and he wouldn't try the potion, but he had to knowing the specific effect of the potion, so I can only let the house elf to test the potion. Fortunately, the potion has been basically perfected. Even if it can't increase the magic power much, it won't cause any harm to the elf. Explain exactly how you feel, Snape ordered. Of order, Professor Snape, Lala feels very strange. Lala's magic power seems to have increased a lot. Lala can now clearly perceive every ounce of her magic power. Lala seems to have more precise control over her magic power, but Lala feels like it's only temporary, Lala replied. Snape and Julian exchanged glances at each other. It seems to have had an unexpected effect, Julian said to Snape, and then to the elf, Lala, how much the magic power has increased, how much you can perceive the magic power, how precise the control is, these are all accurate. One time. Okay sir, the magic power has increased by 10%. I can now perceive every ounce of magic power in my body. As for control, if Lala needed 7 parts of magic power to cast a spell, now she only needs 5 parts. Lala answered Julian's question respectfully. Carefully recorded Lara's description in the notebook, then looked at Snape and said, Professor, although it produced an unexpected effect, our original intention was to increase the magic power, and the magic power of this potion has only increased by 10%. This is too much less than the 40% we expected, and it has not achieved the basic effect of the medicine, but we can set up another subject to study the side effects that just occurred. Snape nodded in agreement, then glanced at the time and said, Wait a minute, after the effect of the potion on the house elf wears off, tidy up the test bench, and you can go back to the dormitory and come here at 8 o'clock every night from now on. Experiment, I'll greet Professor McGonagall. After that, Snape ignored Julian and turned out of the lab. After 2 hours, the augmentation reaction on Lala disappeared. After Julian recorded the time, he tidied up the experiment table and walked to the Tower of Gryffindor. Luckily for Julian, he didn't run into Filch and his cat along the way. After Julian answered the password and pushed open the door of the lounge to enter the lounge, he found that there seemed to be a person on the sofa. When Julian approached, it turned out to be Hermione, who was already asleep with a book in her hand. Hermione, wake up, why are you falling asleep here? Julian pushed Hermione lightly and said. Where did you go? You didn't come back so late. I waited for you for a long time. I asked Harry and Ronald. They said they didn't know your whereabouts. We almost went to find Professor McGonagall. Are you going on a night tour now? You can't do this, you will cost us points. Hermione said excitedly as she came to her senses, looking at Julian. Hey, don't get excited girl. I'm back, and I don't have a night tour. I'm going to discuss potions with Professor Snape. Julian comforted, and then questioned, By the way, you've been waiting for me for so long, is there anything you want to tell me? Hearing Julian's words, Hermione's face turned red all of a sudden, and then stammered, I want to apologize for what happened that morning. I didn't mean to slap you, I just subconsciously, and then. Looking at Hermione who hesitated and apologized in front of him, Julian smiled and patted Hermione's head, and said gently, Relax Hermione, I didn't take this matter to heart at all, but if you can come and apologize, I'm still very happy. Hermione blushed even more, either because she was happy to have Julian's forgiveness, or because Julian slapped her on the head. The atmosphere suddenly became ambiguous, and just when Julian was about to continue to say something, a joking voice suddenly came from the door of the lounge, saying, Aha, I caught 2 first-year kids who were secretly having a tryst. As soon as Julian and Hermione turned their heads, they saw the Weasley twins appearing at the door of the lounge. Obviously they were the ones who made the noise just now. Hermione blushed even more when she saw Brother Weasley, picked up her book and ran towards the girls' dormitory without saying a word. Julian silently looked at Hermione, who was running for her life, and thought, it's a good thing they didn't slap me. It's pretty quick, said one of the twins. Our little genius of Gryffindor is not only talented in learning, but also a genius in falling in love. It seems to be more talented than learning. Yeah, the other of the twins affirmed. I heard Paul say that you had an affair with that girl a long time ago, but I didn't expect it to be true. Stop making trouble. My relationship with Hermione is normal, please stop talking nonsense. Julian said helplessly. We know that the relationship is normal, a normal relationship between boyfriend and girlfriend, we understand, we understand. The twins said in unison, and then laughed together. Julian gave up arguing with the twins and instead asked, what are you guys doing out there so late? Little Ronald said that his good friend, the little genius of Gryffindor, can't be found, so please let us look for it. The twins replied. Julian's heart warmed, and he thought of Zishui in his previous life, and then thanked the twins, then thank you all, and I even bothered to let you make an extra trip. It's okay, we didn't have enough for dinner anyway, so we went to the cafeteria to find something to eat, and I'll find you by the way. One of the twins said nonchalantly. Julian returned my touch, fool. After a while, Julian recovered his mood, said good night to the twin brothers, and went back to the dormitory to sleep. Nothing to say all night. The next morning, Julian was woken up by Ronald and Harry, and asked what he did last night. Julian said listlessly, I went to do experiments with Professor Snape last night. After answering, Julian continued to lie down and went back to sleep, leaving only Ronald and Harry with shocked faces. Harry, Julian is not a spy sent by Slytherin. After finishing speaking, before Harry could reply, he went back to bed and fell asleep. After Julian got enough sleep, it was already close to noon. Julian looked around, and the beds were already empty. Maybe they should go to eat. After getting up, washing and tidying up, Julian also went to the restaurant for dinner. When passing by the common room, Julian saw Hermione reading there, so he went up and asked, Are you still reading, Hermione, have you eaten yet? Hermione, who was reading the book carefully, blushed instantly after hearing his voice, which was really pretty. Ignoring Julian, Hermione left with her book in her arms, as if Julian was some kind of scourge. Julian looked at Hermione, who left with a dazed expression, thinking, what's the matter, it can't be because I'm too shy. But also, little Hermione was probably too shy to be bumped into that misleading scene again and again. Without thinking too much, Julian walked towards the restaurant with cheerful steps. When they came to the restaurant, they saw Harry and Ronald eating, so they walked over. Noticing Julian's arrival, the two made room for him, and when Julian ordered something delicious to eat, Ronald said, So, it's true. What are you talking about, Ronald? I don't understand. This mashed potato is delicious. Julian, who answered Ronald vaguely, stuffed another big mouthful of mashed potato into his mouth. You don't know, it's all crazy, Ronald said with a look of shock. Right now, all of Gryffindor is rumoring you're dating that Hermione Granger, Ronald said before Julian squirted out the mashed potatoes he hadn't swallowed. Fortunately, there was no one on the opposite side of them. After Julian cleaned up the traces with his wand, he looked at Harry and Ronald with a look like a fool, and said, Who is so idle, gossip about me? Seen by Julian's eyes, the two felt uncomfortable and said, The news came from a third-year senior. His name seems to be Paul. He lives in the same dormitory as Fred and George. Let's go, I asked him, and he swore that he saw you and Hermione having a tryst on the Hogwarts train, and then asked us if you left on the way. So how did you answer that? Julian asked. Of course we answered the truth. You did leave halfway, didn't you, and you were called away by that Hermione Granger. Ronald replied honestly. And just when we went to question that senior Paul, Fred and George were there, and they testified that you and Granger did have a tryst in the common room at noon last night. Harry added, knife aside. The confused Julian didn't know what to say. He thought to himself, no wonder Hermione was acting weird this morning, the crux of the problem was here. After a while, Julian came to his senses and said quietly, You two cheat your teammates so much, does your family know? Seemingly startled by Julian's tone, Ronald and Harry hurriedly clarified, We didn't gossip with you. They said to Julian in unison. You guys are worse than gossip, homework for a week. Julian gritted his teeth and said. Of course it wasn't that Julian asked Ronald and Harry to do his homework, but that Julian didn't copy their homework for a week. Hearing Julian's words, Harry and Ronald were terrified for a moment, and Julian's punishment almost killed them. No, Julian, you can't do this, it's going to kill me, Ronald said in a trembling voice. Yeah, Julian, I'm counting on you for my potions homework. Harry was clearly taken aback, too. You should do your homework by yourself, otherwise, what will you do during the final exam? No one will help you at that time. Julian said with an expression of, I'm looking after you. In the next 20 minutes, Harry and Ronald kept bombarding Julian's ears, trying to make Julian give up the punishment, but Julian, who was determined, would not be persuaded by these two, and Julian even gave himself a, shut your ears and listen. After eating, Julian ignored Ronald and Harry, and went directly to the library to continue studying Animagus. The weekend ended with Julian working on the Animagus during the day and experimenting with Snape at night. At 12 o'clock on Sunday night, Julian came back from the potions laboratory. Looking at the group of young wizards who were not sleeping in the lounge, Julian felt a little strange. Finding Ronald and Harry in the crowd, Julian asked, Why are you so crazy at night? Don't sleep, are you not afraid that Professor McGonagall will find you at this party? Don't be so serious, Julian, you know, we have flying lessons next Thursday, with Slytherins, but that's pretty cool, isn't it? Harry said excitedly. Flying class, I only did flying psychic beasts before, but riding a broom here seems a bit weird. Julian muttered. Ignoring the crazy little wizards, Julian got up from the sofa with his things in his arms, and went straight to his bed. In the next few days, Julian experienced the status of Quidditch in the hearts of little wizards. No matter where Julian went, he would meet bragging little wizards, and all versions of stories were also told by little wizards. It was spread out, like when I was riding a broom and encountered thunder and dodged lightning when I was a child, what riding a broom and encountered a muggle helicopter, and even more outrageous, saying that I lived on a broom for several months without food and lodging, on the broom. Julian was stunned by the imagination of the little wizards. Julian even suspected that the little wizards grew up on brooms in their childhood. Anyone who didn't ride a broom for a few years was not called childhood. However, the little Muggle-born wizards were completely stunned. The Muggle-born little wizards, represented by Hermione, began to frantically search for all materials and information about brooms and Quidditch in the library. Even some young wizards from wizarding families began to look for information nervously, so as not to make themselves embarrassed during the flying lessons. Like Neville Longbottom, Neville Longbottom, Neville Longbottom, etc. Watching Neville nervously follow Hermione, listening to Hermione read aloud a book called, How to Ride a Broom Better. Julian felt speechless for a while, saying, Brother, this is not a matter of reading books, for a person like you who has nothing to do and falls on the flat ground to amuse himself, Julian always thinks that Neville will have an accident during the flying class. Finally, Thursday came, much awaited by the young wizards of Gryffindor and Slytherin. When a group of Gryffindor wizards came to the open space for flying lessons, the Slytherin wizards had already arrived. As soon as everyone stood up, Mrs. Hooch, the local professor of flight class, arrived. It was a capable professor with short hair and a pair of eagle eyes, at least Julian looked like this. When her eyes swept over Julian, Julian felt like he was being watched by an eagle, and he felt uncomfortable. The aura of this professor is really powerful, Julian thought. What are you waiting for? Go to the broom and say, get up. Sure enough, thinking so, Julian came to the side of the broom, stretched out his right hand and said, get up. Instead of getting up, the broom rolled on the ground, and an embarrassed Julian looked up to see that all the other little wizards had failed except for Harry and that little brat Malfoy. Most of the classmates are like him, the broom just rolled on the ground. In order not to be ashamed, Julian picked up the broom with his foot while others were not paying attention, and then pretended to have just succeeded, and began to look at the broom in his hand. This broom is very old, it looks like an old broom that has been used for decades. In fact, the brooms at Hogwarts are indeed a bunch of old brooms, and they are indeed all decades old, and I found that the appearance is different from the usual ones. The broom was no different to Julian, so he opened his blood wheel eyes to observe the broom that could take people flying. Under the observation of the blood wheel eyes, the difference of the broom immediately appeared. Clear magic lines shine on the handle of the broom, and silver-gray magic power flows in the lines. One must know that wizards do not need magic power to use broomsticks. Yes, that is to say, the driving of the broom is only based on the wizard's simple movements. Obviously, the broom has its own energy supply device. Thinking of this, Julian moved his eyes to the tail of the broom. Sure enough, there is a magic power supply device at the tail of the broom. This device provides magic power to the weft broom continuously. The continuous magic power seems to be some kind of alchemy product. If you use this device as the core, and increase the magic power output of this device, wouldn't it be nice to make a cloak that can release the protective spell at all times, or store magic power in this way, and then release the magic power at critical moments? Julian was excited, as if a new path had opened up before him, one that would be full of honor and money. Julian, who was thinking about his idea, was patted by Ronald next to him, and Julian, who came back to his senses, complained, "Ronald, what are you doing?" "I'm thinking about something." "Thinking? Then please tell me, Mr. Woollis, what were you thinking about during my flying lessons?" Mrs. Hooch's stern voice came from beside Julian. Hearing Mrs. Hooch's angry voice, Julian subconsciously shivered, and then looked around. I saw that all the little wizards except him were already riding on their broomsticks, looking at this side with a smile on their faces, especially Malfoy and his followers. Their smiles were extraordinarily exaggerated. Speaking of Malfoy, his feelings for Julian are actually very complicated. Malfoy's feelings for Julian were full of admiration, awe and hatred, not just Malfoy, but most Slytherin snakes. The story of Julian killing the Malfoy family has long been rumored among nobles. After all, the circle of nobles is so big, and the Malfoy family is the best in this circle, so there are many stories about the Malfoy family's embarrassment. Everyone is happy to see this joke. The embarrassment of the Malfoy family brought out Julian's strength. After the Diagon Alley incident, many pure-blood nobles investigated Julian. Although the child's life was very simple before, but after this child entered the magical world, after that things are not so simple. First of all, he was guided into the wizarding world by Dumbledore. Although most purebloods don't like Dumbledore because Dumbledore is too close to Muggles, they also have to admit that Dumbledore is no less powerful than Voldemort, and don't forget the previous one. The person who was brought into the wizarding world by Dumbledore was Voldemort, so Julian, who was brought into Hogwarts by him, had attracted the attention of the major families. Secondly, when they knew that Julian had just entered the Leaky Cauldron, he was given a bottle of potion by Master Marcus, the Master of Potions, although they didn't know what the potion was, or even why Master Marcus gave Julian a bottle potion, but this does not prevent them from guessing. So Julian was given a noble and sad identity by these pure-blooded nobles, such as some descendants of fallen nobles that they had never heard of. In fact, when they knew that the Sorting Hat said that Julian had extremely pure-blooded blood afterwards, they became more certain of their own thoughts. After all, the Sorting Hat can't lie. In the subsequent magic runaway incident, they affirmed Julian's extraordinariness even more. So before their children came to Hogwarts, almost all the pure-blood nobles specifically confessed that their children were not allowed to provoke Julian, and even Lucius Malfoy also confessed to his son in this way, which is why Julian clearly beat him. The face of the nobles representing the Malfoys and no one bothering him. These pure-blood nobles care not only about honor, but more about profit. Why Voldemort was able to gather a large number of Death Eaters in the early days was because Voldemort advocated pure blood and despised Muggles and Muggle-born wizards, persecuting them and not obtaining their wealth, just like a certain Hitler slaughtering a certain Jew is not just racial discrimination, but more to obtain the property of a certain Jew. We all know that the Jews are the world's the smartest race in the world, and holds a lot of property. The huge benefits among these made these pure-blood nobles fall to Voldemort one after another. Don't forget that Voldemort is also of mixed blood. Although they gave Voldemort a lot of support, and this kind of support is more like investment than loyalty, this is the case with the Malfoys, who invested more in Voldemort than loyalty, so the people who are really loyal to Voldemort are actually except there are not many outside a few people. It's far away, so in fact, most of the pure-blood nobles don't look at Julian so disgustingly. On the contrary, they will appreciate Julian very much, and even support him for the benefit that Julian can gain for them in the future. The only thing that makes them criticize the thing is Julian's unknown lineage. But when their children wrote to them about what had happened at the sorting ceremony, the only criticism disappeared. The above are all my own opinions, don't spray if you don't like it. Looking back to the flying lesson, Julian, being reprimanded by Mrs. Hooch, quickly straddled the broom like everyone else. Looking at Julian, who was doing well, Mrs. Hooch nodded in satisfaction and said, "When I count to 3, everyone kicks the ground lightly and floats up. After I blow the whistle, everyone is listening to my next step. Instructions, very simple, ready to start, 1, 2. Before Mrs. Hooch called 3, the nervous Neville actually flew up ahead of time and kept floating upwards. Come down, Longbottom, come down, Mrs. Hooch said nervously, obviously not expecting this to happen. Looking at Neville, who was flying higher and higher, and Mrs. Hooch, who was nervous on the ground, Julian thought speechlessly, I'll go. This Mrs. Hooch is too unreliable. You just let Neville come down. He didn't say how to get down. What do you let Neville do? The human design is broken, Mrs. Hooch. Thinking of this, Julian cast the amplifying charm on his throat, and shouted, Neville, don't be nervous, hold the broom tightly with both hands, balance yourself, then lean forward, and slowly press the broom head down. Julian obviously overestimated Neville's courage. Neville, who was terrified by the high altitude, kept shouting loudly. He obviously didn't hear Julian's words. As the broom flew higher and higher, Neville's screams gradually disappeared from everyone's ears. The edge disappeared. At this moment, Neville's broom suddenly lost control, leading Neville on a rampage, constantly turning somersaults in the air, and finally Neville was thrown off by the broom because of lack of energy. Amidst the crowd's exclamation, Neville's screams gradually returned to everyone's ears. Even Mrs. Hooch was stunned by the scene in front of her, and froze there for a moment. Looking at Mrs. Hooch, who was still in a daze, Julian knew she couldn't be relied on, so he pointed the wand in his hand at the place where Neville was about to fall, turned it into a quagmire with the transfiguration charm, and pointed the wand at Neville again. Way kept shouting, Wingardium Leviosa. The spell did not catch Neville, but slowed down Neville's falling body, and finally fell into the quagmire at an unpleasant speed. It wasn't until this time that Mrs. Hooch came to her senses, and quickly stepped forward to help Neville out of the mud. Fortunately, the mud in the mud was rotten enough, and Neville was fine except for the pain all over his body. Mrs. Hooch still supported Neville to the medical room, fearing that something might be wrong with him. Mrs. Hooch did not forget to warn everyone not to touch the broom before she left, or she would be fired. Looking at Neville, who was helped away by Mrs. Hooch, Malfoy suddenly jumped out and said, "Did you see that idiot's expression just now? I don't think he knew he lost his things." After that, Malfoy raised the memory ball in his hand. The memory ball is a gift from Neville's grandmother to Neville. Once the holder forgets something, the memory ball will produce red smoke to remind the holder. But the embarrassing thing is that although it can remind the holder of something he has forgotten, it cannot remind the holder of what he has forgotten, so the memory ball has almost no effect on Neville. Bring it to Malfoy. The only one who would say that was obviously Harry, who hated Malfoy. Why should I listen to your scarhead? I'm going to hide him and let that idiot find him. What do you think about the tree? Malfoy said as he rode on the broom. Seeing Malfoy, who ran away after being provoked, of course Harry didn't want to, so he wanted to get on his broom and chase after him. Looking at Hermione beside him as if about to say something, Julian grabbed Hermione's hand and said, "Don't worry about Hermione, Harry will be fine, he has his own ideas. But if this continues, not only will he be injured, but points will be deducted from Gryffindor." Hermione said worriedly. "Hermione, listen to me, you don't have to be like this, don't take the score so seriously, don't you feel that life will be very tiring? Besides, look around, they are all children, it is the nature of children to play around, if you are so rigid, you will not be able to make friends. I've heard them say that you stand out among the girls and don't socialize with others. It's wrong to continue like this. You have to try to make friends with others. Don't you think Harry came back safely?" As they spoke, Harry and Malfoy had finished the air chase, which ended with Harry snatching the remembrance ball. Seeing the little wizards cheering around, Julian said to Hermione, "Look how happy they are laughing." Looking at the little wizards cheering around, Hermione finally showed a happy expression on her face. "You're right, I really need to make a change." After finishing speaking, he gently kissed Julian on the cheek while everyone was not paying attention. Then before Julian could react, he blushed and backed away. Julian froze for a moment, ran his hand over the place where Hermione had sneaked up on him and smiled. After a while Harry was taken away by the furious Professor McGonagall. At least it seemed that Professor McGonagall was very angry. Mrs. Hooch came back and added 10 points to Julian and ended the flying lesson hastily. The final result of the final handling of this matter was surprising, and Harry was admitted to the Gryffindor Quidditch team by exception. Until then, the turmoil in the flight class was completely over. In the evening, the three of them went to the restaurant for dinner as usual, and almost everyone in the restaurant was staring at Harry, which made Harry very uncomfortable. During the period, Malfoy came over and made a provocation, and finally made a duel agreement with Harry under Julian's gaze, just tonight. Unfortunately, I have to go to Professor Snape to do experiments tonight, or I will take over from Ronald. Julian said regretfully. It doesn't matter, Julian, Ronald is enough. Speaking of which, what kind of experiment do you and the old bat have to do? It's been almost a week and it hasn't been finished yet. Harry asked suspiciously. It's nothing, I found a recipe by accident, and I'm working on it with Professor Snape. Julian said nonchalantly. Oh my god, you invented a new potion, you're so cool bro. Ronald exclaimed. It's not that exaggerated Ronald, basic practice, don't say anything, just sit and watch. Julian said calmly. Just as the three of them continued to eat dinner, the twin brothers came to Harry's side and said cheerfully, Well done Harry, Wood told us that Fred and I are both on the academy team and we are batters. Wood doesn't want us to make it public. In fact, everyone in the school knows now that you are the only one who joined the team in the first grade in nearly a century. Your performance will be great. After the twins finished speaking, they left with a smile on their faces. You talk too much, Harry. Julian teased. I'd rather not have so many topics. I don't even know if I'm qualified for this position. I heard from Wood that the position of the Seeker is very important. Harry said in a low voice. Actually, Harry, Quidditch is a team sport. Anyone in any position is very important. It will not work if anyone is missing. Besides, Harry, you have this talent. Do you remember the minecarts in Gringotts? Most of them people can't bear it, but your performance is very ordinary. In fact, Harry, you have Quidditch blood in your body. After Julian finished speaking, he took Harry and Ronald to the Hogwarts Honor Showcase. In the cupboard was a gold medal with the words, Best Seeker James Potter, written on it. Harry lay on the display case, staring blankly at the medal. At 8 o'clock in the evening, Julian arrived at the Underground Potions Laboratory on time again. Julian greeted Snape who was doing the experiment. It was the potion that added buff last time. Julian's formula gave him new inspiration and went to his experiment table. Pharmaceutical synergy test. The 5th time, reduced the dose of magic grass, added the heart key of Gala King Kong. The potion changed from silver gray to bright silver, and the effect increased from 2.5% to 3.5%, and the duration was also changed from 2 hours. It's been down to an hour and a half, and the house elves have no adverse reactions. 4 hours later, Julian recorded the new experimental data. After recording the data, Julian was about to pack up his things and leave, when Snape stopped Julian. Warless, how is the completion of the potion? It's almost perfect, just need to make some small changes. Julian replied. Snape nodded and said, Come with me to a party for Christmas. Julian was taken aback. Obviously he didn't expect Snape to say that. He could only reply with a wry smile, Okay Professor, please let me know in advance. This is Snape's style, he does not allow others to disobey what he believes in. Just as Julian stepped out of the laboratory door, Snape's voice came again, I heard that Potter joined the Quidditch team. Julian froze again, and just as he was about to reply to Snape, Snape said, as stupid as his pompous, exhibitionist father. Then Snape said, I've given you a task, Worries, to teach Potter about potions. If Potter's performance doesn't satisfy me, you don't want to come here anymore, just go. After finishing speaking, without giving Julian time to reply, he waved and closed the door of the laboratory. Julian, who was left alone outside the door, was stunned at the door. Contemplating the question of whether Snape had gone mad all the way, Julian made his way to Gryffindor's tower. Julian, who happened to be back at the door, met Harry, Ronald, who was back from the duel, and Hermione and Neville. Wait, Hermione and Neville. Hermione, what did you and Neville do? Julian asked suspiciously. I planned to wait for you to come back and ask you some transfiguration questions, but seeing Harry and Ronald preparing to duel, I thought it was interesting, so I followed along. Hermione replied shyly. Wait, what are you talking about? Wait for me to take it easy. Julian supported his aching forehead, and said, you said you saw Harry and Ronald going to a duel, but you didn't stop it, but thought it was interesting, so you went to watch it together. Yeah, didn't you say you wanted me to make some changes today? Hermione asked with a puzzled look. I asked you to make some changes, but I didn't expect you to change so thoroughly, your whole personality has changed, okay. Julian complained in his heart, expressing that he was very tired. It's nothing, you're fine like this. Julian replied feebly, turning to Ronald and Harry and asking, how did you win the duel? No, that scumbag Malfoy didn't come at all. He lied to us and got Filch to catch us. We would have almost died in that room on the 4th floor, thanks to Hermione. Harry was indignant. Speaking of the room on the 4th floor, is that the one Dumbledore talked about when he started school? Julian asked. Yes, that's the room. You don't know what's in that room, Julian. Harry returned. What's in that room that can almost kill the 4 of you? It must be quite dangerous. Julian asked cooperatively. It's a subspecies of a 3-headed hellhound. Julian, it's too scary, how could there be such a thing in school? Ronald said in shock. It's guarding something. There's a trapdoor under that 3-headed dog, haven't you noticed? Hermione replied quickly. Who's going to pay attention to that kind of thing when their lives are at stake? Ronald retorted. When everyone returned to the common room, the 4 were still in shock. Julian conjured up 4 cups of hot cocoa and gave them to the 4 of them, then took Hermione's hand and walked to the girl's bedroom, said goodnight to her, and watched her go back to sleep. Returning to the common room again, seeing the ambiguous gazes of the 3, Julian suddenly had the urge to hit someone. Julian, you still said it's nothing. Judging from your situation, it's basically a stone hammer. Ronald teased. Hearing Ronald's words, Harry and Neville both giggled, looking at the 3 people in front of them. The desire to hit others that had been suppressed just now rose again, and finally Julian gave them a blow, and the 3 barely suppressed their desire smile. After the 3 of them were back to normal, Julian looked at Ronald and asked, you guys met the hell 3-headed dog tonight? Listen to what you mean, is there really a hell 3-headed dog in this world, is there really hell? Quote. Ronald waved his hand and said, it's a subspecies of the 3-headed hell dog. Also, I don't know if there is hell, but I know that the real 3-headed hell dog is said to be 100 meters high, with the flames of hell burning on its body. There is a powerful black magic that was developed based on the flames of the 3-headed hellhound. As for how they came here, no one knows at all. Why are you interested in this, Julian? Then I suggest you go to the library to look it up, but I think this kind of dangerous magical creature is only related to the restricted area. Information. Ronald shrugged. Leave that aside, Julian said, turning his head to Harry, who was listening with gusto. Harry, I'm going to tutor you in potions from tomorrow, and we have to get up at 5 o'clock tomorrow morning. Now you go to bed and go to sleep. After speaking, Julian got up and prepared to take Harry to the dormitory. Harry was stunned and hurriedly said, Julian, why are you so mad? Why are you teaching me potions? I didn't have a convulsion. It was Professor Snape who had a convulsion. He asked me to teach you potions. He said that if you failed to meet his requirements, I would be forbidden from going to the laboratory to do experiments. God, it's just about your potions grades. When will I have to make up for it? Fortunately, it's not long since school starts, and I haven't learned much, so I can still make up for it if I work hard. Okay, don't talk nonsense, now, right away. Go to bed immediately, and get up at 5 tomorrow morning to recite potions textbook, Julian said with a serious face. I protest. Harry protested immediately. Resistance is futile, Julian suppressed instantly. Then Julian dragged Harry back to the bedroom in front of Ronald and Neville, and went to bed. Afterwards, a beautiful scene appeared in the Gryffindor common room, and their savior was actually reciting potions textbooks every early morning. After that, the news of the savior's love of learning spread from Gryffindor. When many students saw him, their eyes were full of respect. Seeing how hard the savior is studying so hard, and seeing what capital he has in school every day, Li Shaleng, for a while, countless little wizards secretly made up their minds that they must study hard. In the following period of time, Hogwarts unexpectedly ushered in a rare learning fever. The Hogwarts professors who knew the reason all praised Harry one after another. And Harry covered his darkened eye circles and said that he would rather not have such a compliment. Of course, this is all for later. The next morning, Julian got up before 5 o'clock. Looking at Harry who was still sound asleep, Julian pulled out his wand and gave Harry a soundproof spell, and then a spell of clear water like a spring was stuck on Harry's body, on Harry's face. Harry, who was awakened by Julian in this way, of course didn't want to get up, so he wanted to resist, but any form of resistance was ineffective in front of Julian, the devil. In the end, Harry still shed humiliating tears and was beaten by Julian. The big devil dragged himself off the bed. After tidying himself up, Julian didn't care how messed up Harry was, and continued to drag Harry to the common room, took out his own potions book, and then began to explain to Harry from the first page of the potions textbook. Half an hour later, Julian stopped explaining. During this period, in order to wake up the sleepy Harry, Julian smeared Harry's face with clear water like a spring more than once. Then let Harry memorize everything he explained. Looking at the sleepy, yawning, sleepy, and hard-working Harry, the last one crossed out, Julian was filled with satisfaction. Today, he rescued another internet-addicted teenager who went astray. I'm so happy. At 7 o'clock, the little wizards who had classes got up one after another. When they came to the common room, they were all shocked by the scene in front of them. The savior Harry Potter was learning potions, and it was still so early in the morning, the whole school knew that Harry and Snape didn't get along. But now, the one who doesn't deal with him is actually studying potions, so what I see is not a fake Harry Potter, is it? The little lions were brave, but they were more reckless. Looking at Harry who was studying potions early in the morning, everyone was not moved by Harry's studious appearance, but doubted the authenticity of Harry. For the little lions, they can do it and try not to force them. Soon, the little lions, headed by Fred and George, pressed the fake Harry on the sofa, poked Harry's face with their wands, and asked, "Are you who? What about Harry? Where did you get Harry?" "I'm Harry." Harry was obviously stunned by the scene before him, but with a strong desire to survive, he quickly explained, struggling. Although Harry explained, the lion cubs didn't believe him at all, and said, "Don't be kidding, the whole of Hogwarts knows that Harry and that old bat, Snape, can't deal with it. How could Harry take the initiative to learn potions? You're lying to a fool. Tell me where you got Harry." "I'm really Harry. I didn't do it voluntarily. I was forced by Julian." "Really? If you don't believe me, ask Julian." "You believe me, you must believe me," Harry said in an extremely aggrieved way. The voice shouted. "Is Julian real?" George asked suspiciously. "I don't know. Who knows what happened to Harry this morning? He called me up early in the morning and asked me to teach him potions. Of course, I can't shirk tutoring, which is something within my ability, so I came to tutor Harry, but it's a bit suspicious after you say so," Julian said with an innocent face. Hearing Julian's answer, Harry was stunned, and struggled hastily. "No, that's not the case. It's obviously you who called me up by forceful means. It's obviously you. Julian has said that. You must not be true." Let the brothers push him to Professor McGonagall. After Fred finished speaking, he pushed Harry to Professor McGonagall's office. Fortunately, there was no one on the way. Otherwise Harry would lose all face. The matter was finally known to Professor McGonagall, and finally Harry survived under the assurance of Professor McGonagall. Harry, who came to the restaurant, looked at Julian with resentment on his face, and said, "Julian, won't your conscience hurt if you trick me like this?" "No, not only does my conscience not hurt, but I even feel a little happy," Julian replied. Harry died. In the afternoon, potions class. Snape still pushed the door open just before class time. "Worries, come up and be my assistant. Today we are going to refine." As soon as Snape finished speaking, Julian walked towards the podium. In the next hour, Snape refined the potion, and Julian handed Snape the processed medicine and materials. As for who handled it, of course Julian handled it on the spot. Otherwise, why do you think Snape asked Julian to come up to be his assistant? Julian handled it very carefully and smoothly. All the movements were as standard and perfect as the textbook, and the cooperation between the two was perfect. Now I believe Julian went to find Snape to do experiments tonight. Ronald whispered to Harry, looking at Julian and Snape on the podium. Harry nodded in agreement. An hour later, a brand new bottle of potion was refined. 1 point for Gryffindor, Snape said calmly. Although Snape's tone was calm, the hearts of the little snakes and lion cubs in the audience were not so calm. Professor Snape actually gave extra points to houses other than Slytherin, and it was Gryffindor who got extra points. The little snakes looked puzzled, while the little lions looked happy. Could it be that Professor Snape has changed his gender and stopped targeting as Gryffindor? Snape didn't know what the snakes and lions were thinking, but he looked at a group of snakes and lions with different faces under the podium, and said with a frown, "What are you waiting for? Why don't you hurry up? Woolies, you don't have to do anything, just do what you need to do." After finishing speaking, he ignored everyone's mood and began to patrol the classroom. Julian was also delighted when he heard Snape's words. Of course it would be good not to waste time. So he went to Snape's bookcase and went to look for Snape's books. Seeing Julian's behavior, all the young wizards were stunned. It was Professor Snape's bookcase, and Julian dared to rummage through it. He must have bloated. The little lions of Gryffindor looked at Julian with worried faces, worried that he would be penalized by Snape, while the little snakes of Slytherin looked at Professor Snape with the same worry, wanting to see if Professor Snape had really changed his gender, began to treat Gryffindor as equals. However, to their surprise, Snape continued to patrol the classroom as if he hadn't seen Julian's behavior. This result surprised all the young wizards. However, not long after the little lions of Gryffindor were happy, the bad news came. Neville, yes, this big brother again, misplaced the ingredients again, causing his cauldron to explode, but did not cause much damage. Professor Snape deducted 5 points from both Neville and Harry as a matter of course. As for why Harry's points were deducted, it was because Harry didn't remind Neville how to put the materials. This result also made the young lion cubs understand that Snape was still the same Snape, and the old bat was still the same old bat. As for the little snakes in Slytherin, they were happy. Well, Snape hasn't changed, but why is he so nice to Julian? Could it be that Gryffindor is Professor Snape's favorite student? I can't figure it out. I can't figure it out. By the end of this potions class, rumors that Gryffindor had a lion cub who could give Snape a bonus point, and that the cub was actually Snape's favorite student spread throughout the school in an instant. And according to people familiar with the matter, Julian would conduct experiments with Professor Snape until late every night, and people familiar with the matter also broke the news that Julian obtained the right to travel at night from Professor McGonagall because of doing potions experiments with Professor Snape. As for who the insider was, there could be anyone but a certain Potter and a certain Weasley. Rumors were spreading in Hogwarts, and the two protagonists of the rumors did not respond positively to the rumors, which also made most of the young wizards in Hogwarts believe this rumor. After that, it was even rumored that Julian was a Slytherin non-staff student. After all, Julian's performance at the sorting ceremony was obvious to all, and the sorting hat did indeed assign Julian to Slytherin from the very beginning, but Julian chose Gryffindor himself. The little snakes in Slytherin acquiesced to this statement, and even some little snakes would greet Julian politely when they met Julian at school, and Julian responded with a smile. Living statement. Although the rumors were quickly drowned out by time, the story of Slytherin's supernatural remains deeply in the hearts of all the little wizards until it explodes someday in the future. On the weekend, early in the morning, Harry, who had just been tortured by Julian, was lying at the dining table looking hopeless. Seeing Harry vomit, Ronald shuddered, and continued to struggle with the sandwich in his hand. Julian looked at the half-dead Harry in front of him, and said, "Okay, don't pretend to be dead, get up and eat quickly, just in time to make up for you while today is the weekend." "Really, Julian, you are so inhuman. What did I do wrong? Harry Potter, why did you treat me like this?" Harry said with a look of grief and indignation. "It's not that I want to treat you like this, but that Professor Snape wants to treat you like this. By the way, you really don't know why Professor Snape is targeting you like this?" Julian looked at Harry suspiciously and asked. "God knows why that old bat treats me like this. From the beginning of the school feast, I can see that the old bat doesn't like me, but I didn't expect that he actually didn't like me to such an extent. By the way, Julian, don't you know what?" Harry also looked at Julian suspiciously and asked. "Probably, but it's not necessarily true. It's my half-baked guess." You want to know? Julian asked. Of course I did. Maybe after knowing why the old bat treated me like this, I could fight back. Harry said excitedly. Yeah, Julian, maybe we can fight back against the old bat. Even Ronald came over and said excitedly. Julian looked at the excited two people in front of him and said helplessly, let me say yes first, the following are all my speculations and only part of the information I checked. First of all, Harry, you grew up in the Muggle world, so you're unlikely to offend Professor Snape when you were a child, Julian said, turning his head to Harry, who nodded in agreement. Harry, you said that Professor Snape didn't like you at the opening banquet, right? Actually, I also noticed Professor Snape's gaze at that time, so I started to ask about Professor Snape. I really asked Hagrid something. Julian said, pretending to be mysterious. Hagrid, tell you what, Julian, tell us quickly. Harry asked eagerly. Leaving that aside, Harry, has anyone ever told you that you look like your parents? Julian asked. Although he didn't know the meaning of Julian's question, Harry replied without hesitation, Hagrid, Professor Flitwick, they all said it. They must have said that your face resembles your father, and your eyes resemble your mother, right? Julian said with certainty. Yes. Harry nodded in the affirmative. So Julian took out 2 photos, handed one of them to Harry, and said, here's a photo of your parents, I got it from Hagrid. Hearing Julian's words, Harry quickly snatched the photo from Julian's hand, and looked at it carefully. Looking at the young man and woman smiling at him in the photo, Harry's eyes blurred instantly. After a while, after Harry calmed down, he looked at Julian and said, Julian, I'm fine, you can continue talking. Looking at Harry's tightly clenched hands in the photo, Julian said, Harry, relax, this photo was originally intended for you, don't be so nervous. Harry let go and motioned for Julian to continue. After making sure Harry was okay, Julian opened his mouth and continued. I asked Hagrid, Professor Flitwick, Professor McGonagall and other professors and staff who have stayed at Hogwarts for more than 20 years, and I got a very interesting thing from their mouths, that is, your parents and Snape the professor as a classmate. Julian paused. So I asked them about your parents and Professor Snape's school situation, and they also told me the general situation. At that time, your father was in Gryffindor, as was your mother, and Professor Snape was in Slytherin. Hearing this, Harry looked proud. Ignoring the proud Harry, Julian continued talking. Harry, your father is the heir of the pure-blood Potter family. He was the man of the school when he was in school. Well, he said he was the man of the day, but he just liked the limelight. Your father and the other boys are just like the current ones. Fred was the same as George, but, boy, who didn't have a second-degree illness when he was young. Your mother, Lily, was of Muggle origin, very smart, especially talented in potions, just like Hermione is now. And Professor Snape seemed to have a poor family when he was young, and Professor Snape was very taciturn and introverted when he was in school. Even in Slytherin College, no one communicated with him very much. However, for some reason, your father, James Potter, and Professor Snape have turned on each other, just like you and Malfoy now. But there is a difference. At that time, Professor Snape was alone, but your father was surrounded by people, so whenever your father and Professor Snape had conflicts, it would be Professor Snape who suffered the loss. In other words, it was Harry, your father has been bullying Professor Snape, now you can understand why Professor Snape has been targeting you. Because I'm my father's son, just because of that? Harry asked in disbelief. Harry, isn't that enough? Can you imagine what it's like to be bullied by another group for 7 years? You told me that you hate the Dursleys because you were abused by them for 11 years, you know how it feels, you should know how it feels to be bullied. Harry, if it were you, what would you do to the son of your enemy if you were Professor Snape? Julian asked Harry calmly. I don't know. Harry said, a little at a loss. Seeing the gloomy atmosphere in front of him, Ronald hurriedly smoothed things over. Julian, don't you still have a photo in your hand? What is that photo? Harry, who heard Ronald's question, quickly raised his head to look at Julian. Looking at the gazes of the two, Julian thought for a while before speaking again. If I'm not wrong about this picture, it should be the reason why your father confronted Professor Snape. After that, Julian handed the second photo in his hand to Harry, and said while passing the photo. Harry, as I said, I also saw the way Professor Snape saw you for the first time. In fact, Harry, as far as I am concerned, what I see in Professor Snape's eyes is not only hatred and disgust, but also a little love, Harry." "What? You said love?" Harry was clearly taken aback by Julian's words. After reacting, Harry immediately retorted, "Julian, are you kidding me? Snape sees love in my eyes." Ignoring the overreacting Harry and Ronald, Julian continued, "The answer is in that picture, Harry. This photo is nothing. Isn't it just two children, a little boy and a little girl?" Harry looked at the photo in his hand in puzzlement and asked, "You are looking carefully at the little girl in the photo, and comparing it with your mother's photo, what can you see?" Julian asked flatly. Harry obediently compared the two photos, and after a while Harry seemed to have discovered something and looked up at Julian in shock and asked, "The little girl in this photo is my mother, what about this little boy?" "As you'd expect, Harry, with that signature greasy hair and that nose, who else?" Julian continued. Harry was silent for a moment, then said bitterly in his voice, "This little boy is Snape, isn't it?" Julian just nodded without saying a word. Ronald was stunned when he heard Harry's answer, took the photo out of Harry's hand and looked at it carefully. "That old bat, no, what's the relationship between Snape and my mother?" Harry asked bitterly. "If I'm not mistaken, your mother and Professor Snape should be childhood sweethearts." Julian replied. "I found this photo from a book written by Professor Snape. Since he still has this photo, I think he must have unusual feelings for your mother. Either he is a good friend or..." Julian did not keep talking, because he understands that if you stop talking, it will not be beautiful if you talk too much. "I don't know what Professor Snape thinks of you, but I think the professor asked me to help you with your potion study. Maybe it's just that he doesn't want your mother's goodness to disappear from you, or he doesn't want to let me help you with potions. Your potions talents are overshadowed by your Quidditch talents inherited from your father. It fits Professor Snape's character very well, doesn't it?" After all, Julian himself laughed, and looking at the smiling Julian, Harry also laughed, and the resentment towards Snape in his heart was slightly reduced, just a little. Looking at the smiling young man in front of him, Julian didn't know if what he did was right or not, but a voice in his heart urged him to do it. That voice told him that if he didn't do it, neither he nor Harry would regret it. Even Julian, the motives and clues for doing this are all told by his inner voice. Julian doesn't know what this voice is, but he can do whatever he wants. Chapter 31. The heavy topic made the atmosphere between the three of them heavy. After a while, Harry handed the second photo back to Julian and said, "Give it back to Professor Snape. I think he needs this photo more than I do. This one is enough for me." Julian looked at Harry, who handed the photo back to him, and Julian asked with a smile, "It seems that you have thought about Harry, so what is your decision?" "I will study potions with you well. I will study potions well, not for Snape, just for my mother," Harry said solemnly. Julian, who heard Harry's answer, showed an old father's expression, and said happily, "Harry, you have grown up." Ignoring Julian, Harry gave Julian a supercilious look and continued to struggle with his breakfast. The atmosphere returned to an active state. In a short while, it was time for the owls to deliver the courier. In front of everyone, 6 owls in a flock of owls carried a thin and long package together. The 6 owls were sent by Hedwig. The snow owl that Julian gave Harry was named Hedwig by Harry and flew towards the 3 of Harry. Looking at the 7 owls in front of him, Harry felt a little numb. What the hell? Before Harry could speak, Ronald wanted to open the package, but was stopped by Julian, who had already observed the package with his eyes. "I'm not sure who sent it, but I think it's best not to open it here," Julian said with a firm tone. "So what exactly is it?" Harry looked at the package in front of him and said curiously. Harry had a guess in his mind, but he couldn't be sure because it was forbidden for first graders. Looking at the 2 people who only had the package in front of them, Julian said helplessly, "If you want to know so much, why don't you open the letter under your nose and take a good look?" Hearing Julian's words, the 2 reacted quickly, and then went to get the letter on the foot of the leader of the 6 owls. Opening the letter, Harry and Ronald quickly read the letter, and then excitedly said to Julian, "Julian, in the package is the broom that Professor McGonagall gave me, or the latest Nimbus 2000, which we saw in Diagon Alley. Yes, do you remember?" "What are you going to do?" Julian asked, looking at Harry, who was about to run out with his broom. "Then there's no need to ask. Of course I'm going to try a new broom." This is the latest broom of the Nimbus series. Harry, can I try it later? Ronald answered Julian in a reasonable tone, and then turning to look at Harry again, he said, after you tried it, of course. Of course, Julian, won't you try it? Harry looked at Julian and asked. Forget it, go try it, I have no interest in flying broomsticks. Julian said with interest. Well, that's such a pity. Harry said without looking sorry at all, and then he and Ronald ran off to the pasture. Looking at the two excitedly, Julian said with a smile, what two children? Then you are not a child, Julian, why do you always like to speak in such an old-fashioned tone? A clear and sweet voice sounded from behind. Turning his head to look at the girl behind him, Julian joked, Hermione, why are you willing to come out of the lounge, you know now is the best time to study. Ignoring Julian's jokes, Hermione sat on the chair next to Julian, ordered something she liked, and began to enjoy her own breakfast. And Julian was lying on the side watching Hermione silently. The sun shone through the ceiling and shone through the entire hall, and a touch of golden yellow sprinkled on the two of them. A faint sense of sacredness. The little wizards around looked at them, and took the initiative to stop the hustle and bustle, as if they didn't want to destroy the peace and warmth. The professors who were surprised by the unusual quietness of the little wizards raised their heads one after another, wanting to see what was unusual, so the professors saw this scene. Looking at Julian and Hermione in the audience, Dumbledore smiled faintly and said, it's nice to be young. Although Dumbledore's voice was not loud, Julian and Hermione seemed to feel something, and both raised their heads to look at Dumbledore. Noticing Julian and Hermione who were looking at him, Dumbledore gave them a gentle smile and continued to eat his breakfast. After Hermione finished eating, Julian took Hermione's hand and walked out of the hall. The little wizards in the hall returned to their senses in an instant, regretting the scene just now. Soon, the rumors of Julian and Hermione circulated in Hogwarts again, and this time the rumors were no longer specious rumors, but confirmed the rumors that Julian and Hermione were already together. They both had Professor Dumbledore's blessing. Hermione and Julian, who were involved, were walking by the lake at this time. It's a rare opportunity to come here to see it. I didn't expect the scenery of Hogwarts to be quite beautiful, Julian said happily. Yeah, Hermione replied out of nowhere. Feeling that Hermione's mood was not quite right, Julian looked at Hermione and asked, Hermione, what's wrong with you? I feel that your mood is not quite right. It's nothing, I'm just thinking about a question, and my head is getting a little big. Hermione replied. What are you thinking about? Tell me and I might be able to give you an idea. Julian said enthusiastically. Can you help me? Hermione asked uncertainly. Well, I can be sure that no matter what problems you have in the future, Hermione, I will be by your side, help you, protect you, I assure you. Julian said confidently. Really, that would be great, Hermione replied, and then asked excitedly, then Julian, can you tell me the quantitative meaning in Elton's potion formula? I am willing to be with you. Wait, what are you talking about? Elton's potion formula, you were thinking about this just now? Julian asked in surprise. Yeah, otherwise what do you think I'm thinking about, and what do you want? Hermione asked with a cute face. I am nothing. Julian secretly MMP in his heart. Okay, I know what you mean, Julian, let's go back to the castle and explain Elton's potion formula to me. After that, Hermione took Julian's hand and walked towards the castle. The morning sun shines on the lake, and after being refracted by the lake water, it shines on the two of them, just like in the hall. At night, at 12 midnight, it was still the underground potions laboratory. Julian asked Lala, how is Lala feeling? Lala's magic power has increased by about 4.50%, and the other feelings are slightly worse than the potion I tried for the first time. Lala said seriously. Looking at the earnest look in front of him, Julian nodded excitedly, then turned to Snape and said, Professor, our short-term magic potion has basically succeeded, and the clinical trials are left. Snape nodded and said, I'll be in charge of the clinical trials. Okay, Professor, then I'll go back first. After finishing speaking, Julian was about to leave. Wait, Snape started. What else is there for Professor Snape? Julian asked suspiciously. Snape pondered for a moment, then took a book from his bookshelf, handed it to Julian, and said, this book contains a potion note left by a friend of mine, you go back and study it carefully, by the way teach Potter the above knowledge. Snape turned and walked out of the potions laboratory. Opening the first page of the book in his hand, Lily Evans was written on it. Julian took a rough look at the back of the book, and the whole book was full of concise, clear and graceful handwriting. I guess it's Harry's. After finishing speaking, Julian looked weird, then put the book away, and went back to the Gryffindor Tower. Nothing to say all night. The next day, Julian handed the book Snape gave to Harry and asked Harry to study hard. Harry, who got the book, refused at first, but when he saw the name on the first page of the book, Harry silently put the book away. Looking at Harry, who put the book away, Julian nodded in relief. Time flies, and it has been a month since school started unexpectedly. During this month, Julian has accomplished many things. With Snape's help, he has perfected the short-term magic boosting potion, and the booster that Julian and Snape made by coincidence, buff potion. With Snape's help, Julian sent the formulas of the two potions to a large potion wholesale shop, and Julian and Snape shared 30% and 20% of the net profits respectively. Julian and Snape jointly published a large number of papers on potions, and the statement that Julian was Professor Snape's favorite student was completely confirmed in Hogwarts. At the same time, Julian's name was once again circulating in the wizarding world, and was named a rising star in the potions world by the Daily Prophet. For a while, Julian was in the limelight at Hogwarts, and even the famous Harry Potter was overwhelmed by Julian. On the other hand, Julian ignored the changes in the outside world and continued to study Animagus, hoping to complete the changes as soon as possible, and then go to the Forbidden Forest to explore. Soon, Halloween will arrive. A group of little wizards were sitting in the hall enjoying a Halloween feast, and the festive atmosphere was particularly strong in the hall. Above the heads of the little wizards floated enchanted candles and pumpkin heads, and above them flew bats, apparently conjured by spells for the festivities. Looking at a pile of food made of pumpkins in front of him, Julian complained, "Why do a bunch of wizards celebrate Catholic and Orthodox festivals?" Helpless, Julian looked at the pumpkins on the table, so he could only put some barbecue and vegetable salad on his plate. When all the little wizards were eating happily except Julian, suddenly the door of the hall was opened, and a person rushed and stumbled. It was Professor Quirrell, and he gasped, "Troll, there's a troll in the dungeon, I thought you knew." Professor Quirrell fainted after he finished speaking. Of course he was faking it, and Julian could easily tell whether a person really fainted, thanks to the basic qualities of a ninja trained in his previous life. Looking at Professor Quirrell lying on the ground, the little wizards suddenly fell silent, and then they all stood up in a panic, and everyone was in a mess. At this time, Dumbledore's voice came, and the panicked little wizards calmed down, and then followed the prefect's arrangement in an orderly manner, and evacuated from the hall one by one. Julian, who was evacuating, suddenly felt himself being pulled. It was Harry. "Julian, I just heard from Ravenclaw that there is a second grader who seems to be in the girls' room and hasn't come to the lobby. We have to inform her," Harry said hurriedly. Looking at the slightly nervous Harry in front of him, Julian nodded, then turned to Hermione and Ronald and said, "You guys go back first. Harry and I will go find that Ravenclaw, and then we will go back." After finishing speaking, without waiting for the two of them to refute, they left the crowd with Harry and rushed to the women's restroom on the second floor. The two escaped Hufflepuff's prefect and Snape during that time. "Snape, what are you doing? Why isn't he staying with the other professors?" Harry questioned. "He's running upstairs." "Forget about that now, Harry. See what that is," Julian said. Before Harry could react, he smelled a strong stench, which seemed to be the result of a pile of unwashed socks that had been worn for a long time, and then sealed and fermented. Suddenly suffocated by the stench, Harry felt that he hadn't come up in one breath, and almost passed his breath. Luckily, Julian responded in a timely manner. Seeing Harry like this, Julian cast an air-freshening spell without saying a word, and then put a bubble headgear on himself and Harry. "Thanks, Julian, I almost thought I was going to die just now. By the way, what did you show me?" Harry asked after taking a long breath. Before Julian could reply, Harry heard a heavy footstep coming from far and near. Harry poked his head and saw that it was a huge monster with a height of 4 meters, a head taller than Hagrid, dragging a big wooden stick in his right hand, with ragged clothes and rough skin on his body. "Is this the troll?" Harry asked. "Yeah, well, keep quiet and see where it's going," Julian whispered. When the giant monster passed by them, the stench almost broke through into the bubble. When the troll came to the door of the women's toilet, it scratched its head with its hands, then it seemed to think for a while, and finally the troll lowered its head and squeezed in through the door. Before Julian could react, Harry jumped out of Julian's side in a jerk, and then rushed to the door of the women's toilet with great speed, quickly closed the toilet door, and inserted the latch. Then Harry looked at Julian with a silly expression, as if he was about to compliment me. Before Julian could say anything, there was a sudden scream from the toilet. The sound was very high-pitched, and it couldn't be made with the rough and savage appearance of a troll. After hearing the voice, Harry's face instantly turned pale, and cold sweat dripped down his forehead like water. Looking at Harry, who was stunned there, Julian knew that Harry was unreliable, so Julian went to the toilet door and kicked the door open. There were smashed tiles and toilets everywhere in the toilet. Fortunately, although there was sewage on the ground, there was no blood. As if hearing Julian's door opening, the troll turned around and looked at the little bug in front of him, then yelled and rushed up holding a stick, trying to smash the little bug in front of him into a meat paste. An exclamation came from behind the giant monster, "Get out of here!" Julian did not dodge, but raised the wand in his hand and pointed it at the troll, and said softly, "Wingardium Revis Orsa," followed by a burst of red light. A rhinoceros that was one size bigger than ordinary A-circled rhino appeared in front of Julian. As Julian waved his wand, the rhino rushed towards the troll. The troll was hit by the rhino that reached its waist and lost its balance. Coaxed, fell to the ground with a bang. Julian waved his wand again, whispered, "Wingardium Revis Urusa," again, and then there was another surge of red light, and a 15-meter-long boa constrictor as thick as a bucket appeared in the women's toilet, and then entangled towards the giant monster. The giant monster was tightly entangled by the giant python, and the whole monster seemed to be tied up. Obviously Harry was shocked by the scene in front of him. Such a big monster was so easily picked up by Julian, and didn't Julian recite the levitation charm just now? How did these two giant monsters come about? There were a lot of question marks in Harry's heart, and just when Harry was about to ask, a series of footsteps came. Then a serious voice came over. "What the hell are you doing?" It was Professor McGonagall. "Why didn't you obey the order and go back to the dormitory? Don't you know how dangerous this is?" Professor McGonagall continued to rage. "Professor McGonagall, please don't do this, they are here to save me." The rescued girl carefully squeezed away from the troll who was trying to escape from the python's entanglement. "Student Chu Jong, why are you here?" Professor McGonagall was obviously a little surprised. "It's like this, Professor, I'm going to the bathroom here, and suddenly this big guy broke in, and when I was about to be killed by the troll, Mr. Worries rushed in and saved me." Chu Yong said in a hoarse voice. "I think things are clear. This classmate didn't attend the Halloween dinner for some reason, and happened to run into a troll, and was rescued by Woolus who rushed over. Am I right, Woolus?" Snape slowly said. Julian, who understood that the other party was helping him, nodded, and said to Snape, "Yes, Professor, just as you said." Professor McGonagall, who understood the whole story, said in a slightly gentler voice, "You are too impulsive, this is an adult troll, you will be injured." Looking at the giant monster that was entangled by a giant python and crushed by a rhinoceros, Julian said, "Actually, we handled it pretty well, didn't we?" "Oh, yes, there are very few little wizards who can face a grown-up troll alone and defeat it like you, and even grown-up wizards can rarely do it, and I have to say, you guys did a great job, but Mr. Worries, can you tell me what kind of magic this is?" Professor McGonagall said with a rare smile. "A modified version of the levitation charm, Professor McGonagall." Julian replied briskly. "Levitation spell?" Professor McGonagall asked again with a look of surprise. "Can the floating spell do this?" It is such a professor. During the charms class a few days ago, Professor Flitwick said that someone once conjured a bison because of the wrong levitation spell. So I thought maybe I could change the spell to summon animals that would help me. After that, I thoroughly analyzed the spell, and found that the floating spell can indeed achieve the effect of summoning creatures after slightly changing the order of the magic power. So I kept trying, and now with the revised floating spell, I can summon some creatures like rhinos, giant pythons, lions and tigers to fight for me. As now, Julian finished speaking and looked at the three behemoths who were still wrestling. As if shocked by Julian's words, everyone present fell silent. It's a very brilliant idea. I think Mr. Woolies can publish a paper about his spell if he wants, and we should give Mr. Woolies a certain reward. Professor Flitwick said briskly. Professor McGonagall nodded and said, Warless, would you like to publish your charm? Of course, Professor McGonagall, it's my pleasure, Julian replied quickly. Very good, Woollis, very good, 20 points for Gryffindor, you have no objections, Professor Flitwick, Professor Snape. Professor McGonagall said excitedly. Both Snape and Flitwick shook their heads to indicate to Professor McGonagall that they were fine. That would be great, Julian, then write down the process of inventing your spell and the method of casting it to me, and I'll help you post it on the Daily Prophet. As for Woollis, Potter, and Miss Chu Jong, you all go back to the dormitory and rest, and leave the rest to us. Professor McGonagall said. Good Professor, good night, Professors. Then the three said goodbye one by one and left the women's room. Walking to the stairs, Chu Jong glanced at Julian nervously, and said shyly, Thank you, Woollis, and you, Harry, good night. Chu Jong stepped forward and kissed the cheeks of the two, then ran back shyly. Looking at Harry who was covering his face and watching Chu Jong disappear blankly, Julian went up and slapped Harry on the head. Look, I fell in love with him, my soul is gone, don't look, let's go. After all, without waiting for Harry's reaction, he dragged Harry over to the Gryffindor Tower. The two who returned to the Gryffindor lounge were quickly surrounded by Ronald and Hermione, who kept booing and asking each other. Hermione and Ronald felt around Julian and Harry respectively, making sure they were not hurt. Then the four of them sat around and listened to Harry and Julian describe what happened just now. They both let out a gasp when they heard Julian defeat a grown troll with a modified version of the levitation charm. Brother, you actually adapted a spell, you are so cool, you will even be featured in the Daily Prophet. Ronald said excitedly. Julian will definitely appear on the Daily Prophet. Before coming back, Professor McGonagall asked Julian to write down his spell adaptation process and ideas and spells in the form of a paper. She and Professor Flitwick will jointly recommend it to the Daily Prophet. Harry said enviously. While Harry and Ronald couldn't contain their excitement, Hermione's angry voice came over. Julian, how can you use untested charms? It's too dangerous, if something happens, you will be injured, and you also heard from Professor Flitwick that wizard Barufeo was almost crushed to death by that bison. Oh, Hermione, you're such a disappointment too. Ronald complained. It's okay, my girl, I had Professor Snape take care of me when I was experimenting with the spells, and if anything happened to me, he would help me. Julian told a white lie to Hermione said. But, that's also, Hermione wanted to say something, but was interrupted by Julian. Okay, my girl, there are not so many but, I'm fine now. Don't worry my girl, I didn't eat much in the hall just now, I need to replenish my 5 internal organs temple, come on, eat something with me. After finishing speaking, without waiting for Hermione's rebuttal, he pulled Hermione to the table in the lounge, picked up 2 plates from there, and gave one to Hermione, and then the two openly threw dog food in the lounge. Seeing the two people throwing dog food when they disagreed, Ronald and Harry couldn't help but rolled their eyes, and then each took a plate and ate. Julian wasn't going to Snape's lab tonight, but had a peaceful dinner with Hermione before going back to the dormitory to sleep. It's too much, the old bat is too much, Harry said angrily after entering the common room. It's Professor Snape. Harry, why did Professor Snape provoke you? Julian asked flatly. He confiscated the books I borrowed from the library, and actually deducted 5 points from me. The reason is that the books in the library cannot be taken out of the library. I didn't know there was such a school rule. Harry sat on the sofa angrily said. Harry, did you do something to make Professor Snape angry again? Otherwise Professor Snape wouldn't find a reason to pick on you. Julian looked at Harry angrily and asked. No, since you told me that, I have restrained my emotions very much, and I hardly have conflicts with the old bat. This time, the old bat came up and asked me a very profound potion question. How could I know, I'm not you. Harry grumbled. What question did Professor Snape ask you? Julian asked curiously. He asked me, what is the main ingredient of the Modola petrochemical potion? How do I know the main ingredient of the Medora petrochemical potion? Julian, do you know? Harry continued to ask angrily. The relevant information about Medora potion is described in the second chapter of your mother's book I gave you, and adding your mother's notes can increase the success rate of the potion by 30%. It's pretty deep. Why did you forget, or didn't you watch it at all, Harry? Julian looked at Harry playfully and said, "Ah, you know Julian, it's the Quidditch match recently, so I'm well prepared, aren't I? Besides, Wood has also stepped up our training recently, so." Harry said shyly. "So you put more time into Quidditch training and less time studying potions, right?" Julian said helplessly. "Yeah." Harry blushed and lowered his head. "Professor Snape confiscated some of your books. I just have something to go to Professor Snape to see if I can get the book for you," Julian said while flipping through the book. "Oh, Julian, you are my angel. There will be a Quidditch match soon, so I borrowed a book about Quidditch from the library called The Origin of Quidditch," Harry said excitedly to Julian. "Origin of Quidditch, yes, I get it, then I'll go to Professor Snape first." After Julian said that, he put away the book in his hand, got up and walked towards the door of the lounge. "I'll go with you, Julian," Harry said suddenly. "Well, you're not afraid that Professor Snape will kill you again?" Julian turned to Harry and asked suspiciously. "Isn't it because you're here? You're the old bat's favorite student. Generally, where you're around, the old bat won't go too far," Harry said complimentingly. "It's not as evil as you said. In fact, Professor Snape is quite a nice person. Although his mouth is a bit sharp, but Professor Snape is a real knife-mouthed bean curd, so you don't need to be so afraid of him," Julian said with a wry smile. "You're the only one who can say something like that, Julian. I don't think even those guys in Slytherin have the guts to say something like that," Ronald complained. Okay, so Ronald, do you want to come?" Julian asked. "I'll forget it. I don't want to face the old bat's zombie face. I'll have nightmares. Besides, the old bat's leg is injured. I don't want to touch his brow at this time," Ronald said with a smile. "What, Professor Snape's leg is hurt, is it serious?" Julian asked. Julian knew that Snape had hurt his leg, but that was Hallows Eve, it's been a long time, and Julian hasn't been to Snape's lab since then, only in class Snape. However, Julian hadn't paid much attention to his leg, but it took so long to heal, it looked like a magical injury. "God knows, when we were just confiscated by the old bat, we found that his leg was limping, and it hurt so much," Ronald said gloatingly. "Okay, Harry, wait for me for a while, I'll go back to the dormitory to get something." Julian ran to the dormitory after finishing speaking. Leaving Harry and Ronald looking at each other, Harry asked, "What is he going to get?" "Who knows about Julian?" Ronald shook his head and said briskly. After Julian came back, the two walked towards the staff office. When it was time for the office, Harry subconsciously took a step back, then looked at Julian with embarrassment, and made a gesture of asking you. Looking at the cowardly Harry, Julian rolled his eyes at him, and without refusing, went forward and knocked on the door of the staff office. Julian knocked for a while and found no response, exchanged glances with Harry, then pushed the door open and went in. There were only two people in the staff office, Snape and Filch. Snape was indeed injured, and it seemed that the injury was still serious. Filch was applying medicine to Snape's wound, and the whole scene looked bloody. "That dog," Snape swore. "Forget it, how could you stare at three heads at the same time, besides, you have to check the mechanism," Filch said. At this moment, Snape seemed to sense something, turned his head, and saw Julian standing at the door holding a book. "Warless, what are you doing here?" Snape asked in a bad tone, pulling down his trouser legs as he spoke. "Oh, Professor Snape, I originally wanted to ask you a question, but Harry and Ronald heard that you were injured, so I wanted to come over and see if I could help you," Julian said briskly, as he spoke while walking to the side of Filch in the office. "Mr. Filch, please let me." Julian walked to Filch's side and said. Julian and Filch still knew each other. After all, they used to do experiments in Snape's laboratory until late every day. When they returned to Gryffindor, they could always meet Filch, who was watching the night a few times. Seeing that Snape didn't respond, Filch handed over the request to Julian and got up and left the staff office. After taking the medicine in Filch's hand and sitting down, Julian began to observe Snape's wound. The wound looked bloody, reminiscent of the conversation between Snape and Filch just now. Julian instantly thought of what Harry and the others met during their previous night tour. A subspecies of that three-headed dog. Putting down the medicine in his hand, Julian took out a small jar from his robe. Carefully opened the small jar in his hand, and while dipping some black substance inside with a cotton swab, he said to Snape, "Professor, this is the ointment I prepared. It can effectively remove the damage caused by magic on the wound, and also there is a curse left by the wound. I once asked someone to test the efficacy of the medicine when I was in Diagon Alley, and the effect was not bad." Looking at the black ointment that was applied to his wound, a cool feeling came from his legs, and Snape's furrowed eyebrows relaxed slightly. After a while, a lot of black air began to emerge from Snape's wound. Looking at the black steaming wound, Snape knew it was a sign that the curse had been removed from his body. After a moment of silence, looking at the student in front of him applying the ointment, Snape said, "What question do you want to ask me, Willis?" Thinking for a while, Julian looked up at Snape and asked, "Professor, is there really hell in this world?" "Why do you ask that?" Snape seemed a little surprised by the question asked by the student in front of him, so he asked back. "It's like this, Professor. It has been spread among many young wizards that there is a subspecies of hell three-headed dog in the classroom at the end of the corridor on the 4th floor. I'm not interested in what the dog is guarding, but I am. The real three-headed dogs are very interested, and I am also very interested in whether there is hell. If there is hell in this world, will there be demons, are they powerful, and why are there no legends about them in the wizarding world?" Julian said a series of questions asked. In fact, there is still one question Julian did not ask, that is whether there are really gods in this world, and if so, where are they? Listening to Julian's question, Snape's brow, which had been loosened by the healing of the wound, frowned again, and Snape's entire brow knit together. "Warless, I don't think these things are what you should explore. Now, take this book and leave here immediately." With that said, Snape shoved a book on the table beside him into Julian's hand, and began to expel Julian. Julian put the medicine jar in his hand on the side table, and then ordered Snape to apply ointment in the morning and evening, and then left the faculty office after saying goodbye. Julian, who walked out of the office, didn't see Harry. It seemed that Harry had already returned to the dormitory, cursed Harry secretly, and then began to think about Snape's reaction just now. It seems that there is a lot to say here. Then he looked at the Origin of Quidditch in his hand, smiled and said, "Does Professor Snape still know the main purpose of my coming?" After finishing speaking, Julian walked over like the Gryffindor Tower. After watching Julian leave the office, Snape's brows were still furrowed. After thinking for a while, Snape got up and walked out of the office. As for where to go, the direction seemed to be the principal's office. Snape went to talk to Headmaster Dumbledore, but no one knew what the conversation was about. The most direct manifestation of this conversation was that Julian was called to the principal's office for tea the next day. The news was sent to him by the prefect of Ravenclaw early in the morning, but Julian was not in the common room. By the time the prefect of Ravenclaw found Julian in the library and handed him the note, it was almost noon. Because the note said, "Please take time to come to my place to drink tea with an elderly man, chat and relieve boredom." Single quote. So Julian didn't rush to the principal's office after receiving the note, but after lunch, he squinted his eyes in the lounge for a while, and went to the principal's office at around 3 o'clock in the afternoon to visit Dumbledore. After arriving in front of the principal's office, Julian spoke the password mentioned in Dumbledore's letter, and arrived at the door of the principal's office smoothly. Knocked on the door, but there was no response from inside. Julian gently pushed open the door of the principal's office. As he expected, there was no one in the door. The principal should still be taking a nap. Thinking this way, Julian stepped lightly and walked into the principal's office slowly. The principal's office doesn't look very big, and the decoration is very simple. The whole room is full of books. Let people know at a glance that the owner of this house must be a wise person who loves to read. Julian, who didn't know when Dumbledore would be back, picked up a book on Dumbledore's desk, sat in the chair in the headmaster's office and read it with relish. This is a collection of stories. The cover is a bit worn out, but the content is still complete. Julian was reading a story about Reaper and three brothers. The content of the story was the same, but what attracted Julian was the Reaper in the story and the three gifts that Reaper gave to the three brothers: the Elder Wand, Invisibility Cloak and Resurrection Stone. Julian tried to find more information in the book, but he couldn't find it in the end. Just as Julian was immersed in the book, an old and energetic voice came over. "Good afternoon, Julian." It was Dumbledore. "Good afternoon, Professor," Julian saluted. "It's been more than a month since school started, and you don't come to see me, old man," Dumbledore said in a complaining tone, before asking Julian, "Would you like something to drink?" "Tea, thank you." Julian thanked Dumbledore as he took the tea from him. Looking at the storybook in Julian's hand, Dumbledore suddenly smiled and said, "It's very interesting, isn't it, this storybook?" "Sorry, Professor." Julian put down the book in his hand and said quickly. "Why do you have to apologize?" Dumbledore asked gently. "Because I signed your book without your permission," Julian replied. "Relax, Julian, I'm not going to punish a young wizard for reading a book out of curiosity," Dumbledore continued gently. Julian nodded, and took a sip of the tea in his hand, which tasted surprisingly good. Seeing Julian's joyful expression as he tasted the tea, Dumbledore said with a smile, "It tastes pretty good. It was sent to me by an old friend of mine far in the east. It seems to be called Longjing tea." Julian nodded in agreement. Then Julian said, "Professor, you can't really ask me to drink tea. If you have anything to do, please speak up." "Hee, young people nowadays are really not stable at all," Dumbledore said helplessly. Okay, let's get to the point. Julian, I heard from Professor Snape that you want to know something about hell and demons, right?" Dumbledore's expression was still gentle, but Julian could feel the atmosphere. It's getting serious. "Yes, Professor, I'm curious about those," Julian admitted generously. "Julian, you know, this world is mysterious, this world has many secrets, and these secrets are called secrets because no one knows them at all. About hell and demons are part of this world's secrets, know the resting dragon, some secrets are out of reach. So worries should never try to find hell," Dumbledore said seriously. "You mean, does hell really exist?" Julian asked curiously. "I don't know, Julian, I don't know, no one knows if it exists, but anyone who tried to find it never came back. It was horrible, horrible," Dumbledore replied in a trembling voice. Looking at the trembling old man in front of him, Julian couldn't help frowning. Dumbledore must know what kind of things could scare this old man who has experienced hundreds of years of turmoil like this, but looking at him like this, he wouldn't say up. After drinking the tea in his hand, Julian got up to bid farewell to Dumbledore, and made an oath not to seek hell on his own initiative. On the way back to Gryffindor Tower, Julian had been thinking about it. When Julian returned to the Tower of Gryffindor, he found Harry, Ronald and Hermione sitting together and talking about something. He walked over and sat next to Hermione and asked doubtfully, "What are you guys talking about? It seems that the discussion is quite intense." "Julian, it's the old bat. The old bat is going to steal something hidden on the 4th floor. You heard it yesterday, didn't you? The conversation between the old bat and Filch," Harry said eagerly as if he had found his savior. "By the way, Harry, this is all about yesterday, why did you just say it today?" Julian complained lightly. "Also, Harry, you are too nervous. You can't assume that Professor Snape is going to steal something just because of a conversation. Maybe Professor Snape went there to see if anyone is going to steal something," Julian said flatly. "But, that's Snape, how could he not do bad things?" Harry replied stubbornly. "Harry, what kind of logic do you have? Does Professor Snape have to do bad things?" Julian said dumbfounded. "Okay, stop discussing these things, let's focus on the present. Isn't it your Quidditch debut tomorrow? How are you preparing?" Julian said, changing the subject. Sure enough, as soon as Quidditch was mentioned, Harry's expression became even more anxious. He scratched his hair nervously, and then said worriedly, "I don't know how I am preparing. Tomorrow is our battle against Slytherin. Listen to Wood Slytherin's house team is very strong and very good at fouling, so I'm not sure if I can play the seeker position. What if I lose the game because I didn't see the snitch, what if?" Apparently switching the subject to Quidditch was an unsuccessful diversion, as Harry looked more anxious than before. Harry, who had turned on the nagging mode, was obviously frightening, and the three of them avoided Harry one after another, and then went about their own business, leaving Harry alone there, nagging non-stop. The next day came quickly, and the whole academy was in a strange state of excitement. Early in the morning, the four of them came to the hall. Because of Harry's arrival, the little wizards who were discussing Quidditch in the hall became more excited. Little wizards kept coming to Harry's side to cheer for Harry. Well, except for Slytherin, all the little wizards from the remaining 3 colleges came. This also made Harry even more nervous, and finally Julian stood up and told the excited little wizards that Harry needed to eat something, which made the excited little wizards let Harry go. "Thank you, Julian," Harry thanked. "It's okay, Harry, come on, you need something to eat," Julian began. "But I don't have an appetite," Harry said nervously. "You are too nervous, Harry. You must know that Quidditch matches usually take a long time, and you must ensure that you have enough energy to eat this sandwich," Julian persuaded Harry. Harry took the sandwich from Julian with a weeping face, and then forced himself to eat the sandwich in his hand. Not long after, Harry was called away by Wood's men. Then Julian, Hermione, and Ronald rushed towards the Quidditch pitch along with the little wizards in the hall. After arriving at the stadium, Julian found that he had really underestimated the status of Quidditch in the hearts of little wizards. The whole stadium was already full of people, and most of them were probably little wizards who came to the stadium to take their seats without having breakfast. By the time the 3 of Julian arrived at the Gryffindor auditorium, Hagrid's huge body had already taken its place at the top of the auditorium. The 3 came to Hagrid's side, greeted Hagrid, and sat down next to Hagrid. Half an hour later, the match started. When the players from the Slytherin and Gryffindor teams rode into the air on broomsticks, the atmosphere at the scene reached its peak in an instant. The Gryffindor players played really well, and the Slytherin players played really badly. After the Gryffindor players scored 2 goals, the Slytherin started their usual operation, and kept fouling, which made Julian doubt the end of Quidditch. Is it playing football or playing people? Although the behavior of the Slytherin players caused outrage, Mrs. Hooch only gave Slytherin 2 free throws. After all, she can only go so far, because Quidditch doesn't seem to have a red card. Just when Hermione was worried that Gryffindor would lose, Julian comforted Hermione, "Don't worry girl, Harry has found the snitch, we will win." And Harry did find the snitch, not far from him. Just when Harry was going to speed up and grab the snitch, he accidentally let it go. Harry's broom suddenly twisted, with great force, as if he was about to throw Harry off the sky. Harry grabbed the broom tightly, and fixed himself on the broom with all his might. However, the vibration of the broom was getting bigger and bigger, and Harry was almost unable to hold on. Julian, who noticed Harry's abnormality, immediately understood that someone was attacking Harry, and seeing this posture was the rhythm to kill Harry. Julian looked around quickly, and when he saw the professor's chair opposite, Julian noticed that Professor Snape and Professor Quirrell were staring at Harry and muttering something. Just when Julian was about to speak, Hermione, who had snatched Ronald's binoculars, spoke, "It's Snape. I saw it in a book." His eyes were fixed on the target and he said a spell in his mouth, which can cause confusion in the target. Looking at Hermione who was chatting casually beside him, Julian had to admire a woman's sixth sense. Then Hermione, without waiting for Julian's response, put the binoculars into Julian's hand and said, "I'll take care of it, you guys stay here and watch." After speaking, before Julian could say anything, Hermione slipped into the crowd. Looking at Hermione who got out, Julian was speechless for a while, thinking to himself whether Hermione was successfully transformed by himself, or assimilated by the atmosphere of Gryffindor. How could he become so reckless? Handing over the binoculars in his hand to Ronald, and telling Ronald to keep a close eye on Harry, Julian opened his blood-wheel eyes and began to observe Snape and Rocky. The powerful Sharingan quickly discovered the clue. Both Snape and Rocky were repeating this spell, but Rocky was reciting it upright, while Snape was reciting it backwards. It seemed that Rocky was the one who attacked Harry, but why? It was understandable that Snape protected Harry. Julian, but why did Rocky attack Harry? Rocky has a problem. Julian knows it. Julian has never forgotten the feeling of being closely watched at the school opening banquet. In defense against the dark arts class, Julian kept watching Rocky, but Julian never felt that gaze again. It didn't matter. I didn't expect Rocky to make a move on this occasion, and he would kill Harry as soon as he made a move. Looks like I'm going to talk to Professor Snape, Julian thought to himself. Suddenly there was an exclamation from the little wizards in the auditorium, and Julian quickly turned his gaze to Harry. It turned out that Harry fell off the broom. At this moment, Harry was holding the broom tightly with both hands. hanging in the air, but the broom was still shaking. Looking at the scene in front of him, Julian knew that he was afraid, and couldn't wait for Hermione to make a move, so Julian turned his gaze to Rocky again, and the blood wheel eyes activated the Nirvana abode, and Rocky closed his eyes after a while. Just at that moment, Hermione's assist arrived, and Julian saw the bottom of Professor Snape's robes on fire. Oh, poor Professor Snape. Julian felt sorry for Snape secretly before turning his gaze to Harry. At this point Harry was back on the broom, and it seemed that Harry had spotted the snitch again. After a combo, Harry spit the snitch out of his mouth and lifted it up. Gryffindor wins. Amidst the roar of the commentator and the shouts of all the little wizards except Slytherin, the game came to an end. Gryffindor's victory made the Lion Cubs so excited that they even held a celebration party overnight. Until late at night, Harry, who can almost be said to be the protagonist of the party, was dragged to Hagrid's hut by Ronald after the game. Sitting in the hut, Ronald looked at Harry and said, "Harry, it's Snape. It was Snape who cursed your broom, and Hermione and Julian and I saw it." Before Harry could speak, Hagrid interrupted Ronald and said, "Don't talk nonsense. Snape is a professor at the school. Why did he want to kill Harry? But I've read in books that if a person stares at another person maliciously and casts a spell, he can cast a curse on that person, and I saw it with my own eyes. Snape cast a curse on Harry." Hermione retorted. Hagrid said, "But why would Snape attack Harry? It doesn't make sense." Hagrid still didn't believe what Ronald and Hermione said. "Actually, I seem to have discovered a little secret of his, and it seems to want to kill me," Harry said, tangled. "What secret?" Hagrid pressed. "That time on Halloween, I found out that Snape was trying to break through the big three-headed dog in the classroom on the 4th floor," Harry said seriously. "How do you know about Lu Wei?" Hagrid asked. "Lu Wei? Yeah, that's right, that three-headed fluffy is mine, and I lent it to Dumbledore for guard." Apparently Hagrid realized he had slipped. "Watching what?" Harry pressed. "It's nothing, it's top secret, not something you should know," Hagrid said grumpily. "It's from Vault 713, right? That vault that was breached by the Dark Wizard, right, Hagrid?" Julian said calmly. "I said, it has nothing to do with you. Now you go back to the academy immediately, and Harry, Professor Snape won't do anything to that thing," Hagrid said rudely, and he invited the four of them out of the hut. "It looks like Hagrid knows something," Ronald said. "But he didn't want to tell us," Harry said regretfully. "No, we must try to protect the thing, otherwise Snape will get it," Harry said firmly. "So, Harry, why did you be sure that Professor Snape was going to steal that thing? Didn't I say that Professor Snape might also go to check the institution? Why did you be sure that it was Professor Snape?" Julian said helplessly. Looking at Julian, who was still speaking for the old bat, Harry suddenly hated this friend in front of him, thinking of the unfair treatment he had received from the old bat, how Julian helped the old bat torture him, and how the old bat treated him today. The thing that almost killed himself. Harry exploded all of a sudden. Professor Snape, what else can you say besides Professor Snape? Just today your Professor Snape attacked me, and almost killed me," Harry said violently. "Actually, Harry, it wasn't Professor Snape who cursed you, but Quirrell. It was Quirrell who cursed you, and Professor Snape was saving you." Neither Hermione nor Ronald noticed it. Both Quirrell and Professor Snape were chanting curse. Looking at Harry, who suddenly became irritable in front of him, Julian calmly told the truth. "It's Professor Quirrell. Professor Quirrell. Then why didn't the old bat cast a curse on me? Professor Quirrell is saving me. You always have an inexplicable affection for the old bat. You even helped the old bat to deal with me. Aha, I forgot. You are the favorite student of the old bat, the extra student of Slytherin. I believe Ronald's words now. Julian Willis, you are the spy sent by Slytherin." After finishing speaking, Harry did not wait for the three of them. He turned around and left when he had any reaction. At this moment Ronald stood up and said to the two, "Well, leave him to me. Harry seems a little unstable now." Julian, don't take Harry's words to heart. He may be scared because of the stadium now, and Julian, I was joking, don't take it seriously. After finishing speaking, he chased after Harry. "Julian, are you all right?" Hermione asked, looking at Julian worriedly. "I'm fine, don't worry about me, my sweet girl," Julian said in a reassuring tone. "But, Harry," Hermione still said in a worried tone. "It's okay, as Ronald said, Harry might have been frightened by what happened today. He was just venting. It's okay, I didn't take it to heart. Julian said gently. Julian really didn't take it to heart. After all, he was a child, and he would be fine in 2 days, thinking about how Sasuke wanted to kill himself when he was so old. Immediately, Julian said to Hermione, Hermione, you go back first, go have a banquet with them. What about you? Hermione asked worriedly. I have something to take care of, I'll be back soon, don't worry about my girl, see you in the lounge. After saying that, he pecked Hermione's forehead and ran towards the castle. Julian, who ran back to the castle, quickly ran towards the staff office. After waiting for the faculty office, Julian knocked on the door and went in. Snape was not in the office, only Professor McGonagall was grading papers. Sensing the door to the office being opened, Professor McGonagall looked up at the person coming. Warless, it's you, what's the matter, didn't you celebrate with them? Professor McGonagall asked with a smile. Oh, no Professor McGonagall, I want to talk to Professor Snape, I have something to ask him. Julian replied. Oh, look for Professor Snape, Professor Snape just went out, you can go to the lounge. Professor McGonagall replied. Okay, thank you Professor McGonagall. After finishing speaking, Julian was about to turn around and leave the office. Just as Julian was about to leave the office, Professor McGonagall's voice came from behind him. Worries, how is your Animagus doing? Well, I have already prepared the relevant content of Animagus, and I plan to try my first transformation during the Christmas holiday. Julian replied. Well, okay, I'm on duty at the school during the Christmas holidays. When you plan to try it for the first time, please come and let me know in advance. You must not try it alone, Julian. Professor McGonagall said seriously. Then Professor McGonagall said with a strange expression, perhaps Mr. Worries, you can try to add a little luck to yourself, and I think Professor Snape will help you with that. After thanking Professor McGonagall, Julian bowed and left the staff office to continue looking for Professor Snape. Julian, who left the office, walked directly to the underground laboratory. Came to the underground laboratory, knocked on the door, sure enough Snape was here. After opening the door, Snape saw Julian outside the door, opened the door completely, and then turned and walked into the laboratory. Before Julian could speak, Snape said, Warless, come help me. Hearing Snape's words, Julian responded helplessly, then took off his robe and put it on the hanger. After all, it's too hot here. Coming to Snape's side, looking at the medicinal materials Snape prepared, Julian asked suspiciously, is the professor trying to refine a potion for treating trauma? Well, get those ingredients ready, I don't need to teach you how to do it. After finishing speaking, Snape ignored Julian and continued to stir his potion. Julian, who was preparing the medicinal materials, suddenly said, Professor, there seems to be something wrong with Professor Quirrell. Snape, who heard Julian's words, paused and continued to stir. Snape asked as he stirred, what's the problem? Well, during today's game, Harry's broom was out of control for a while. I observed it and found 2 professors on the professor's bench staring at Harry's broom and chanting something. The 2 professors, one is you, and the other is Professor Quirrell. Julian said calmly. Both professors are reciting the same spell, but Professor Quirrell is reciting it forwards, and you are reciting it backwards. I have seen this spell in a book, so I can draw a conclusion. That means Professor Quirrell is going to attack Harry, and you are protecting Harry, right? Julian stopped his hands and looked straight at Snape after finishing speaking. Finding that Snape didn't respond, Julian continued, actually, I noticed Professor Quirrell during the opening banquet. I found something interesting when I saw the back of Professor Quirrell's head. I found that the back of Professor Quirrell's head was like it's like hiding a pair of eyes. As long as I put my gaze on the back of Professor Quirrell's head, I can feel a gaze, the feeling of being stared at is too obvious, this is one of them. At Halloween dinner later, when Professor Quirrell ran into the hall to warn us of a troll, he passed out. Is there a problem with that? It's not impossible for that cowardly guy to be scared. Snape said contemptuously. No, Professor Snape, you must know that he just taught us how to deal with trolls before this, and this method is very simple, any little wizard can do it, and Professor Quirrell has no reason to be scared, and in the end the point is, Professor Quirrell is faking it, and my 5 senses are sharper, so I can tell if Professor Quirrell really fainted. Actually, at that time, I thought that maybe Professor Quirrell was adding a little atmosphere to our Halloween, but it wasn't until Professor Quirrell attacked Harry today that I realized that Professor Quirrell is not that simple. After Julian finished speaking, he looked at Snape quietly to see Snape's reaction. However, unexpectedly, Snape didn't respond, simply nodded and fell silent. Just when Julian thought that Professor Snape had just been addicted to alchemy and didn't hear what he said, Snape said, "Stay with Potter, I'll report this to the headmaster." Although Snape's words were soft, Julian heard them clearly. Then Julian nodded to show that he had agreed. "Prepare a potion of your own invention and come with me to a party on the third day of the Christmas holiday," Snape said suddenly. "Okay, Professor, I haven't forgotten," Julian replied. For the next 2 hours, Julian was in the lab helping Snape with experiments. For the next 2 months, Harry never reconciled with Julian, because he still stubbornly believed that there was nothing wrong with him, it was all Julian's fault, and Julian had been helping Snape to speak. And Julian has been studying Animagus. In order to be able to transform successfully, Julian listened to Professor McGonagall's advice and asked Snape for a bottle of Felicia. Snape didn't ask Julian what he wanted for Felicia, but it was very refreshing to give Julian a bottle. Time passed quickly in Julian's preparations, until Julian finally decided on Christmas Eve that he could try a wave. Because of the Christmas holiday, most of the little wizards from Hogwarts went home, only a small number of little wizards, including the Weasley family, Harry, Julian and so on stayed. In the morning, Julian knocked on the door of Professor McGonagall's office and informed Professor McGonagall that he planned to try the first transformation this afternoon. Professor McGonagall said that he was free in the afternoon and could let Julian transform in the transformation classroom. After receiving Professor McGonagall's permission, Julian thanked him and returned to the Gryffindor Tower. When Julian returned to the tower, he didn't see the three of Ronald, because Hagrid slipped his mouth in a previous conversation, which led to several people knowing that this incident also involved a person named Nicholas, so Harry and Ronald the two kept looking for news about Nicholas in the library. Because of Harry's relationship, Julian did not go with them to find Nicholas, but instructed Hermione to help them. But the three of them searched for nearly 2 months, but they couldn't find any news about Nicholas. In the afternoon, the transformation classroom. Professor McGonagall and Julian stood in the middle of the classroom, and the desks had been cleared aside by Professor McGonagall. Looking at Julian in front of him, Professor McGonagall said, "Remember Willis, once you find something wrong, you must stop transforming immediately, remember?" He nodded to indicate that Professor McGonagall understood that Julian took the Felicia and the short-term magic enhancement potion. After feeling his magic power and physical condition, Julian said softly, "Animagus." Then Julian tried to make his magic power work in his body according to the designated route. After a while, Julian felt his body keep getting smaller. The best evidence was that Professor McGonagall was getting bigger in his eyes, and then Julian noticed that his hands disappeared and replaced by a pair of black feathered wings. After a while, Julian's transformation was completed, and as expected, he was a black crow. Looking at Julian who turned into a crow, Professor McGonagall breathed a sigh of relief, and then became nervous again. Although the first step was successful, the next step is the most important step, which is to overcome the animagus the beast nature brought about by the change. Many wizards were blocked at this step, unable to overcome the beast nature. They were admitted to St. Mungo's Wizarding Hospital to spend the rest of their lives. This is why the animagus is called dangerous magic. However, the steps that are very difficult for most wizards are not a problem for Julian. After all, in the previous life, Julian turned into a crow too much. After a while, Julian changed from a crow back to a human form under Professor McGonagall's surprised gaze. "Mr. Willis, you really..." Professor McGonagall was speechless in shock. Returning to human form, Julian nodded with a smile, then ate some chocolate prepared in advance, and then entered a state of meditation. An hour later, Julian woke up, and instead of standing up, he casually said, "Animagus." Julian on the ground quickly turned into a crow again, but this time he flew in the air. In the transformation classroom, Julian kept circling the roof, and it took a while before he returned to his human form. Looking at Professor Julian McGonagall, who can freely switch back and forth between the crow form and the human form, he smiled gratifiedly. After thanking Professor McGonagall, Julian turned and left the Transfiguration classroom. Now that the Animagus transformation has been completed, the exploration tour of the Forbidden Forest can be put on the agenda. Julian thought so and walked back to the Gryffindor Tower. After attending the Christmas Eve dinner, Julian quickly returned to the dormitory to recharge his batteries. After all, tonight was his first real night outing in Hogwarts. In the evening, it was already past noon. Julian got out of bed and walked towards the door. After a while, Julian quietly left the Tower of Gryffindor. The Animagus whispered and Julian transformed into a black crow again. Julian was happily flying in the empty and dark Hogwarts. He didn't expect that Hogwarts would be so big. Passing through classrooms and halls, the appearance of Hogwarts at night was unfolded in front of Julian for the first time in a real sense. It was so beautiful and full of charm. Julian flew down the corridor, past Filch on his night watch and Mrs. Norris staring at it, feeling so relaxed, so free. When Julian flew into a room, he stopped, not because he was tired, but because there was a huge mirror in this room. Does Hogwarts have such a big mirror? Thinking so, Julian flew quickly to the mirror. Julian regained his human form and stood in front of the mirror, carefully observing the mirror in front of him. The mirror is very large, at least as tall as two Julians, and the frame of the mirror is full of fantastic-looking patterns or words. The top of the mirror has inscriptions made of golden gold that appear to be Erised or 8 ubi Cafrate on Vokes. Mirror of Erised, Julian murmured. Julian then placed himself in the center of the mirror, because he wanted to see what the magic mirror could do. Looking at himself in the mirror, Julian froze, as if nothing had happened. Thinking like this, Julian was about to leave when suddenly some blurred shadows appeared on the mirror. Julian quickly turned around to look back, but there was nothing behind him. The blurry shadow became clearer and clearer. When Julian saw the things in the mirror, Julian was stunned again, because what was in the mirror was his family, father, mother, Shisui and Sasuke. Julian was stunned for a moment, staring blankly at the person in the mirror in front of him. Julian couldn't help but looked behind him, and when he confirmed that there was nothing behind him, Julian turned back body, looking at the person in the mirror again. After looking at it for a while, the picture in the mirror suddenly changed. In the mirror, I was wearing Konoha Onby's action suit, holding a bloody knife in his right hand, and even the action suit on his body was covered with blood. The self in the mirror stood behind the father and mother who were kneeling on the ground, raised the bloody knife in his hand and swung it at them. No! Julian shouted loudly. Following the picture in the mirror, the Sharingan in Julian's eyes gradually spun, and finally the three Guyu gradually connected together to form a windmill. It was Julian's kaleidoscope Sharingan. Julian, who was kneeling on the ground, covered his head with his hands in pain, repeating the picture in the mirror just now in his mind. Looking at Julian, who was covering his head and unconsciously repeating the words, "Stop," and "Don't," Snape sighed softly, and then hit Julian's back with a swoon. Then Julian just passed out unconsciously on the ground. Although I don't know what Dumbledore thought and why he put the Mirror of Erised in this place, but as the last mechanism to protect the Philosopher's Stone, it is impossible to put it here without any precautions. The Mirror of Erised is placed here by the professor they took turns guarding, and tonight's guard was Snape. This room is enchanted. Once someone uses the Mirror of Erised, the guarding professor will know. When he sees Julian standing in front of the mirror, he is his favorite student. Although Snape never admits it himself, Julian, this Gryffindor lion cub, did occupy a certain place in Snape's heart, so Snape still wanted to let him go with one eye closed. But what I didn't expect was that I didn't know what Julian saw in the mirror, which caused Julian himself to fall into that unconscious state. Looking at Julian, who was still distorted despite being knocked out by himself, Snape took out a bottle of potion after a moment's thought, then helped Julian to pour the potion into Julian's mouth. After a while, the potion began to take effect, and seeing Julian's face returning to normal, Snape laid Julian flat in front of the Mirror of Erised, and then cast Quick Revival to wake Julian up. Looking at Julian's blinking eyes, Snape quickly left the room before Julian woke up. After waking up, Julian quickly got up from the ground, and then stared at the magic mirror in front of him. Julian, who had opened the kaleidoscope Sharingan, had already seen through the essence of the magic mirror. Of course, he would no longer be confused by the illusion of the magic mirror, but even so, Julian stood in front of the mirror for 2 full hours, until 3 o'clock in the morning, before leaving the room and returning to the Gryffindor Tower. The next morning Julian woke up amidst a burst of cheerful noise. Thinking about what happened last night, Julian was in a daze until a pillow flew onto him. Julian raised his head, looked at Ronald who was smirking at him, and Harry with a proud face. Julian realized that today is already Christmas. Throwing all the unhappiness out of his mind, Julian shouted loudly at Ronald who was giggling, "Ronald, you dare to throw me with a pillow, you are finished." After that, Julian took out his wand, pointed at Ronald and shouted, "Fly the pillows," and then all the pillows in the dormitory floated up and flew towards Ronald. Seeing the flying pillows, Ronald quickly raised his hands to acknowledge his cowardice, but Julian did not let him go, but directed the pillows to fly towards Ronald continuously with his magic wand, hitting Ronald helplessly. Seeing Harry standing aside and staring blankly, Ronald immediately called for help from Harry. Under Ronald's gaze of the savior, Harry also joined the battle group, but only 2 of them couldn't resist being directed by Julian to rush towards their pillows. Just when Ronald and Harry were about to surrender to Julian in despair, the bedroom door was suddenly opened, and the twins of the Weasley brothers and the prefect Percy came in. The 3 Weasley brothers who had just entered were stunned for a moment, apparently unable to react from the sight in front of them. Then, amidst Ronald's call for help, the twins among the 3 Weasley brothers who rushed in were the first to react, and then pushed Percy, who was still down, to Ronald and Harry, and the 2 immediately picked up a pillow from the ground and joined in battle group. In the end, Julian dropped his wand, took a pillow in one hand, shouted, "Feel the terror of Julian the Great," and led the twin brothers towards Harry, Ronald, and Percy. In the end, the battle ended with 6 people getting a lot of feathers. As for the winner, of course it was Julian and the twin trio. The crowd, who had had enough of playing around, lay on the feathers on the ground and gasped. Laughing, panting, laughing. And the Cold War between Julian and Harry was declared over because of the end of this pillow fight. After the 6 got up from the ground, Julian and Percy used their magic wands to restore the pillows on the floor to their original state, and then the 6 sat on the empty bed and unwrapped the presents. Julian received not many gifts, including a book on potions from Snape, a book on advanced transfiguration from Professor McGonagall, and a bunch of cockroaches and candy from Dumbledore. See this disgusting pile of candy. Julian immediately put down the gift in his hand, because the pile of candy is just like the real thing. Looking at the pile of cockroaches on the bed, Julian borrowed Harry's Hedwig and stuffed his new pair of woolen socks into a freshly unwrapped package, and sent it to Dumbledore in return. Back on the bed, Julian continued to unpack his packages, taking out a piece of Hermione's chocolates, a piece of Chu Jong's new quill, and even received a hand-knitted sweater from Mrs. Weasley. A big Y. Looking at the Y sweater in Julian's hand, Ronald blushed and said, "Brother, I thought you and Harry would not receive any presents, so I wrote to my mother, but I didn't expect that my mother would knit one for you alone. Our family's proprietary sweater. I don't know if you like it or not. I know it may be a bit ugly. If you don't like it, you can put it away." Looking at Ronald who was blushing like a monkey's ass, Julian felt warm for no reason, and said, "Ronald, what are you talking about? This sweater is the most beautiful Christmas gift I have ever received. It is better than all other great Christmas presents." After speaking, he put the sweater on his body. Julian came up to Ronald and asked, "What does Mrs. Weasley like? And I want to give her a gift in return." "You don't need to be so troublesome," Ronald said, blushing. "How can that be? Mrs. Weasley gave me such a perfect gift. I have to return it. What should I give?" Julian began to pace the bedroom. "Aha, I can give Mrs. Weasley some good luck." So saying, Julian came to his clothes box, opened the box and rummaged for a while, and finally Julian found a small bottle of potion, which was golden yellow in color. "The middle is so beautiful." The twin brothers and Percy, who had listened to the conversation between Julian and Ronald, looked at the golden potion in Julian's hand, and not only sighed, "My God, this is the elixir of felicity." "What is Felicia?" Ronald and Harry asked curiously. Felix elixir, also known as lucky water, is a precious and rare potion. It is very difficult to refine. Not only is the formula complicated, but it is also difficult to refine. It is said that it takes 6 months to refine. The slightest mistake will lead to the failure of the potion. Percy replied proudly as if showing off his knowledge. It's so mysterious, you haven't said it has any effect. Ronald looked at his brother dissatisfied and complained. Felix Elixir has only one effect, and that is to allow the user to be blessed by luck, and no matter what they do, they will have their wishes come true. Therefore, Felicia Felix is banned from appearing in competitive events like Quidditch, said the twins excitedly. Julian, this return gift from you is too precious, there is no need to get it. Ronald said hastily after listening to his brother's explanation. No, Ronald, you are wrong, maybe the gift I gave Mrs. Weasley is very precious, but it also has a price, but the sweater that Mrs. Weasley gave me has no price. You know, Ronald, this sweater is this is the first real gift I have received since I was a child. Julian said excitedly to Ronald. Looking at the excited Julian in front of him, and thinking about Julian's growth environment, Ronald said in a firm tone, Don't worry, Julian, I will ask my mother to knit a sweater for you every year in the future. After hearing Ronald's words, Julian smiled and did not speak. Ignoring the people in the room, Julian took the Felicia and rushed out. When he came to the owl house, Julian used a school owl to tie the prepared package and thank you letter to an owl, and then let it out. Looking at the owl flying away, Julian smiled. Very relaxed, smiling happily, the shadow cast by what happened last night also dissipated in Julian's laughter. Returning to the dormitory, Julian saw that only Ronald and Harry were left in the room, so he asked where the others had gone. Ronald said that Percy went to find the prefects, and the twin brothers went to have a snowball fight. Julian looked out through the window. It was indeed a snowball fight, but it was a snowball fight named Quirrell. Suddenly, there was an exclamation from behind Julian. Julian turned around and saw that it was the European Harry who opened the treasure chest and opened the golden magic weapon. I know this is quite rare, who will give you this? Ronald said excitedly. What's this? Harry asked suspiciously. This is an invisibility cloak. It is usually made of the fur of an invisible beast or by using magic. Generally, invisibility cloaks are time-limited and expensive, but yours does not look like a time-limited semi-finished product. Yours seems to be a real invisibility cloak. Ronald said enviously. Here's a letter, maybe you'll know if you look at it. Julian handed the letter in his hand to Harry and said. Taking the letter in Julian's hand, Harry put the invisibility cloak aside, unfolded the letter and began to read it. After reading the letter, Harry said, the letter said, this invisibility cloak belongs to my father, and he returned it to me to let me use it properly. Taking the letter in Harry's hand, Julian read it carefully, and found that the handwriting seemed familiar, as if he had seen it somewhere before. Where is it? Thinking like this, Julian handed the letter paper to Ronald again, and began to look at the invisibility cloak. Taking the invisibility cloak from Harry's hand, Julian carefully observed the invisibility cloak in front of him, and even opened the kaleidoscope Sharingan. The whole invisibility cloak was completely exposed in front of the Sharingan. Julian's eyes. Through Sharingan, Julian discovered that the entire invisibility cloak was tattooed with ancient incantations that looked very mysterious, and the silver magic power flowed in the incantations, which looked so mysterious. After observing for a while, Julian found that he couldn't understand the spell on the invisibility cloak, so he recorded the spell with Sharingan and then returned the invisibility cloak to Harry. Since the letter tells you to use it well, you should use it well, Julian said. In response, Harry took the invisibility cloak and put it on the bottom layer of his suitcase. Then, at the suggestion of the starving Ronald, the three of them set off to eat in the lobby together. I hope everyone will support it and subscribe more.